Rain has passed over the floodplain, leaving the ground dark and soft beneath a low Cretaceous sky. Water gathers in shallow pools between stands of horsetails. Fern fronds bend under droplets. Along the bank of a broad river, a footprint presses into the mud. 3 blunt toes spread forward. Behind them lies the rounded impression of a heel pad large enough to hold both of your hands. A second print follows, then another, all moving in the same direction. The trackway does not belong to a lone animal. More prints overlap beside it. Some are nearly a meter across. Others are much smaller, made by juveniles walking between adults. The river has preserved only a moment, perhaps a few minutes from a single morning, but the pattern is unmistakable. A group passed here together, heavy bodies moving through wet ground, while the water slowly rose around their feet. The animals that made these tracks are usually introduced by the shape of their mouths. Duck-billed dinosaurs. Hadrosaurs, the name, makes them sound almost harmless, as if their most important feature was a broad snout that happened to resemble the bill of a living bird. But the bill was only the front edge of a much larger biological system, and the animals behind it were among the most successful large herbivores the Mesozoic ever produced. For tens of millions of years, hadrosaurs spread across northern continents, crossed into southern lands, occupied coastal plains, forested river valleys, polar environments, and islands separated by shallow seas. They lived beside horned dinosaurs, armored dinosaurs, tyrannosaurs, dromaeosaurs, turtles, crocodilians, mammals, and birds. In many late Cretaceous ecosystems, their bones are not rare exceptions. They are everywhere. A single hadrosaur skeleton can be impressive. Some species reached 8, 10, or even more than 12 meters in length. Their hips stood above the head of a person. Their tails formed deep muscular beams behind the body. Their jaws carried hundreds of working and replacement teeth. Yet the greater story is not the size of one animal. It is the scale of the entire radiation, the number of species, the variety of skulls, the abundance of their remains, and the range of environments they managed to occupy. The title of empire is useful only if it is understood carefully. Hadrosaurs did not rule through command, and they did not conquer landscapes in any deliberate sense. Their empire was ecological. It was built from reproduction, digestion, movement, social behavior, flexible feeding, and the ability to survive in places that demanded very different solutions. It stretched wherever broad rivers carried sediment, wherever flowering plants and conifers formed dense vegetation, and wherever herds could find enough food to keep moving. If the dinosaur age is what brings you back to Jurassical, subscribing keeps the next lost ecosystem close. The tracks continue across the mud and disappear beneath younger layers of sediment. Above them, millions of years of rock will accumulate. Rivers will change course. Seas will advance and withdraw. Mountains will rise. The animals themselves will vanish, but their bones, teeth, eggshell, skin impressions, and pathways through soft ground will remain, waiting for the landscapes above them to erode. Hadrosaurs belonged to Ornithopoda, a long-lived group of plant-eating dinosaurs that began with relatively small, lightly built animals and eventually produced some of the largest and most specialized herbivores of the Cretaceous. Their ancestors did not begin with broad bills or towering crests. Those features appeared gradually, through a history that reaches back into the Jurassic and through generations of animals that looked increasingly like the hadrosaurs to come. Early ornithopods were often compact bipeds with strong hind limbs, long tails, and beaked mouths. Many relied on speed and alertness rather than armor or horns. They cropped low vegetation and processed it with cheek teeth that were more sophisticated than the simple pegs of many other dinosaurs, but they did not yet possess the dense dental batteries that would later turn hadrosaur jaws into powerful grinding machines. One way to understand hadrosaurs is to begin with an animal such as Iguanodon, not because it was their direct ancestor in a simple straight line, but because its body shows several stages of the same broad experiment. Iguanodon had a beak, batteries of closely arranged teeth, strong hind limbs, and forelimbs capable of supporting its weight. It could move on all fours and rise onto 2 legs. The hand still carried a prominent thumb spike, a weapon that hadrosaurs would lose. But the foundation of a large, mobile, plant-processing ornithopod was already present. Through the early and middle parts of the Cretaceous, iguanodontian relatives diversified across Europe, Asia, North America, Africa, and other regions. Some became heavier. The forelimbs grew better suited to quadrupedal walking. The thumb diminished. The front of the skull widened. Teeth became more numerous and more tightly packed. The jaw joints and facial bones changed in ways that allowed a more effective chewing stroke. The exact place and timing of hadrosaur origins remain subjects of research because the transition is recorded unevenly. Fossils are abundant in some formations and absent in others, and many early hadrosauroids are known from incomplete skulls or partial skeletons. The evidence suggests that advanced hadrosauroids were diversifying in Asia and North America during the Middle Cretaceous, with different lineages dispersing between continents, while land connections and northern routes still made movement possible. A quarry face in Mongolia can preserve one part of that transition. In red or gray sediment, a skull emerges with a familiar broad snout beginning to take shape, but with teeth and bones that remain more primitive than those of later hadrosaurids. Animals such as Gobihadros show that not every duck-billed form belonged to the crown family Hadrosauridae. Some were close relatives, successful in their own right, living beside lineages that would eventually replace them. Evolution does not move toward a planned result. For a time, the Cretaceous held several versions of the duck-billed design at once. Some had narrower mouths, some carried fewer tooth rows. Some retained proportions inherited from earlier iguanodontians. Others approached the architecture that would later spread across entire continents. The empire formed through overlap, competition, dispersal, and extinction, not through a single moment when one animal suddenly became a hadrosaur. By the late Cretaceous, true hadrosaurids had separated into two great branches. One branch is commonly called Saurolophinae, containing many species with solid crests, low ridges, elaborate noses, or no large hollow crest at all. The other is Lambeosaurinae, whose skulls carried hollow structures formed by greatly modified nasal passages. These two lineages shared the same basic feeding machinery and general body plan, but they explored very different shapes above the eyes and along the snout. Their success arrived during a period when the world itself was fragmented and changing. The late Cretaceous was not one continuous continent. North America was divided for long intervals by the Western Interior Seaway, a warm, shallow sea that ran from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. Europe was broken into islands. Asia was shaped by inland basins and shifting coastlines. South America, Antarctica, Africa, India, and Australia were separating from one another as the last connections of Gondwana weakened. These divisions created barriers, but they also created coastlines, deltas, estuaries, and floodplains. Hadrosaurs were not marine animals, despite early reconstructions that placed them in lakes and swamps. Their skeletons were built for life on land, yet many of the places they favored were close to water, where rivers carried nutrients across broad lowlands and repeatedly buried carcasses beneath sand and mud. Imagine a river valley in what is now Alberta around 75 million years ago. The sea lies somewhere to the east, beyond coastal flats and humid forests. Channels divide and rejoin across the plain. Conifers rise above stands of flowering shrubs. Leaves have insect bites along their edges. Small mammals move under fallen branches. Turtles rest in quiet water. In the distance, a group of hadrosaurs feeds along the margin of a wooded island in the river. They are not identical. One species may carry a helmet-like crest. Another may have a low ridge along the skull. Their mouths work steadily as they pull vegetation inward. The larger adults remain on all fours, the front of the body supported by strong arms. A juvenile lifts its head, then rises onto its hind limbs to look over the plants. Beyond the herd, a tyrannosaur passes between trees, mostly hidden except for the movement of branches. The hadrosaurs are prey, and the landscape contains animals capable of killing them. Their bones preserve tooth marks. Some skeletons carry punctures that healed, evidence of attacks survived. Yet it would be a mistake to define them only by what hunted them. A successful predator depends on an even more successful supply of prey, and the abundance of hadrosaurs tells us that they were not simply victims moving toward inevitable death. They were durable populations, able to replace their losses and occupy enormous areas. The body plan helped. A deep torso held a long digestive tract capable of fermenting fibrous plants. The pelvis was broad and powerful. The hind limbs could carry the animal alone when necessary, while the forelimbs allowed a slower and more stable quadrupedal gait. The tail remained stiff enough to balance the body, but flexible enough for turns and changes in speed. The head stayed relatively low, close to the vegetation, but could rise several meters when the animal stood upright. Most hadrosaurs were not built like giant lizards dragging their tails behind them. Their tails were held clear of the ground, supported by tendons that stiffened the spine. Their backs were closer to horizontal than the sloping kangaroo-like posture once used in museum mounts. The front limbs were weight-bearing, and the hands were enclosed in pads that spread pressure across the ground. For much of the 20th century, the broad fingers and skin preserved between them were interpreted as evidence of webbing. This helped create the image of hadrosaurs as semi-aquatic animals escaping predators by swimming. It seemed reasonable because of the bill, the flattened tail, and the frequent discovery of fossils in river sediments. But river sediment preserves terrestrial animals too, and the anatomy of the limbs tells a different story. A foot pressed into mud can settle an argument that a skeleton alone leaves open. Hadrosaur trackways show broad pads beneath the hands and feet, blunt toes, and a gait suited to supporting great weight on land. Some track sites preserve parallel movement by multiple individuals. Others record adults and juveniles together. The animals were capable walkers, and some probably traveled long distances through seasonal landscapes. The broad muzzle also requires care. A duck's bill is a soft, sensitive structure adapted for feeding in water. A hadrosaur's beak was a keratin-covered cutting edge attached to a very different skull. The resemblance is real at the level of outline, but the function was not identical. Hadrosaurs used the front of the mouth to crop plants, then moved that food backward toward tooth batteries that no living duck possesses. The bill could be narrow or extremely wide. That difference probably mattered. A narrow muzzle may have allowed selective browsing, letting an animal choose particular leaves, shoots, or branches. A broad muzzle could sweep through a larger volume of vegetation, taking in a more mixed mouthful. Species living in the same region may have reduced competition by feeding differently, even when their skeletons seem broadly similar. The first hadrosaur bones described by science did not reveal all of this. Excavated in New Jersey in 1858 and named Hadrosaurus phocei, the specimen became the first nearly complete dinosaur skeleton mounted for public display when it was exhibited in Philadelphia in 1868. It came from marl deposits in New Jersey, on the eastern side of the continent that once bordered the western interior seaway and the Atlantic coastal plain. The skeleton lacked a skull, so its face had to be reconstructed from related animals and imagination. That mount changed how people pictured dinosaurs. Here was a creature presented upright, with massive hind limbs and a body large enough to dominate a museum hall. It helped move dinosaurs away from the low, sprawling monsters of earlier reconstructions. Yet Hadrosaurus itself remained incomplete, and the animals now most familiar as duckbills would be discovered later in Western North America, Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, and beyond. The fossil record expanded rapidly. Skull after skull revealed a group that had turned the bones of the face into display structures, resonating chambers, cutting surfaces, and supports for elaborate soft tissues. Bone beds exposed dozens or hundreds of individuals. Nesting grounds preserved eggs and hatchlings. Mummified carcasses retained skin patterns and the outlines of hands and feet. Coprolites recorded what entered the gut. Thin sections of bone recorded how quickly young animals grew. Few dinosaur groups have left such a wide range of evidence. That richness can create false confidence. A bone bed does not automatically prove a permanent herd. A crest does not preserve its sound. A nest does not identify which parent returned to it. Skin impressions do not preserve color unless microscopic evidence survives. Every reconstruction must stay close to what the fossils can support. Still, the outline is clear. Hadrosaurs were not an evolutionary footnote at the end of the dinosaur age. They were one of its central achievements, built from a long history of ornithopod adaptation and released into a world of productive floodplains and rapidly changing plant communities. Their broad mouths harvested the landscape. Their jaws reduced plants with remarkable efficiency. Their bodies carried them across continents. Their social lives left patterns in tracks, nests, and massed bones. The footprints by the river are beginning to fill with water now. The smallest disappear first, their edges collapsing as the mud softens. The deeper adult tracks remain visible a little longer. Then, the river crosses the bank, lays down a thin sheet of silt, and seals the entire pathway beneath the next layer of the floodplain. The herd continues inland, and the first part of its history is buried behind it. On a museum table, a hadrosaur skull looks less like the head of a passive browser and more like a machine whose parts have been arranged around a single demanding task. The front is broad and toothless. The rear is deep and crowded with teeth. Between them, the bones of the face form arches, joints, and reinforced surfaces that carried muscle, keratin, skin, and the repeated forces of feeding. The beak formed from the premaxillae in the upper jaw and the predentary at the front of the lower jaw. In life, these bones were covered by keratin, the same general material that forms bird beaks, turtle beaks, claws, and fingernails. Keratin does not usually fossilize, so the sharp cutting edge is missing from most skulls. The bone beneath it preserves the foundation, not the complete tool. Behind the beak, hadrosaurs had cheeks, or at least muscular and soft tissue boundaries, that helped keep food inside the mouth while the teeth worked. The exact anatomy is debated because soft tissue rarely survives, but the position of muscle scars and the need to control plant material makes some form of oral containment likely. Without it, each chewing stroke would push part of the meal out through the sides of the jaws. A living cow has broad molars that meet one another and grind from side to side. A horse carries high-crowned teeth that endure years of abrasive grass. Hadrosaurs reached a similar functional destination through a very different structure. Instead of relying on a small number of large teeth, they packed many narrow teeth into vertical columns, with replacement teeth waiting below the chewing surface. This arrangement is called a dental battery. In a large hadrosaur, each side of the upper and lower jaws could contain dozens of tooth families. Several teeth might be stacked in each family, though usually only one or a few contributed to the active surface at a given time. Across the entire mouth, hundreds of teeth were present, and many more passed through the jaws over the animal's lifetime. The battery was not simply a reserve of identical parts. Hadrosaur teeth contained multiple tissues with different hardness and wear properties. Enamel, dentin, cementum, and other dental tissues met the grinding surface in a controlled pattern. As the teeth wore down, harder regions resisted abrasion, while softer regions receded, creating ridges and basins that maintained an effective cutting and crushing surface. This is one of the most sophisticated dental systems known among vertebrates. It evolved in animals that could not visit a dentist, could not stop feeding for recovery, and could not survive long if the grinding surface failed. The solution was continuous renewal. A worn tooth was not repaired. It was replaced from below, while the battery around it continued to function. Take a block of hadrosaur jawbone in your hands, and the individual teeth can be difficult to see at first. They form a tightly organized wall. On the chewing face, polished surfaces cross tooth boundaries, making several teeth behave like a single broad file. Along a broken edge, the columns descend into the jaw, each one holding stages of growth, from small developing crowns to heavily worn teeth near the top. How the jaws moved has been debated for more than a century. Early researchers proposed that the upper jaws flexed outward during biting, a movement sometimes called pleurokinesis. Later three-dimensional models suggested that some earlier versions of this idea required more mobility than the skull could realistically provide. Other studies emphasize simpler rotations and translations involving the lower jaw and the joints behind the tooth rows. The details remain under investigation, and different hadrosaur species may not have fed in exactly the same way. What is clear is that the upper and lower batteries met along angled surfaces and produced repeated grinding strokes. Microscopic scratches on the teeth preserve the direction of movement. Those scratches are not guesses. They are marks cut into the teeth by food and grit during the life of the animal. A hadrosaur did not chew exactly like a mammal. Its jaw muscles attached differently, its skull bones followed a dinosaurian plan, and the whole system developed through another evolutionary history. But functionally, it achieved extensive oral processing. Plants were cut, crushed, and ground before they entered the digestive tract, increasing the surface area available to bacteria and digestive fluids. This matters because Cretaceous vegetation was not soft garden salad. Conifer needles, woody shoots, bark, fern stems, horsetails, seeds, and tough flowering plants all contained cellulose and other structural compounds that resist digestion. Windblown dust and sediment added abrasive mineral grains. Even leaves can become difficult material when an animal must consume hundreds of kilograms across years of constant feeding. Hadrosaurs were hindgut fermenters, or used some comparable large microbial fermentation system, though the exact layout of their organs cannot be reconstructed directly. Their deep rib cages provided room for an extensive gut. Microbes would have broken down plant fibers that the animal's own enzymes could not digest, releasing energy from vegetation that would otherwise pass through unused. Chewing and fermentation worked together. The teeth reduced particle size. The gut held material long enough for microbes to act. A large body made this process more efficient because bigger animals can retain more food and tolerate lower quality vegetation than smaller herbivores. This allowed adult hadrosaurs to feed less selectively than juveniles and to process fibrous plants that would be difficult for smaller animals. The broad bill is often treated as the beginning of feeding, but in ecological terms, it was a decision about what entered the machine. A narrow-beaked species could direct its bite towards selected branches or clusters of leaves. A broad-beaked species could gather a wider sweep of vegetation with each movement. The shape of the snout influenced diet before the teeth ever touched the food. Gryposaurus carried an arched nasal region and a relatively deep skull. Edmontosaurus developed an especially broad, flattened muzzle. Lambeosaurines such as Cretaceous and Hypacrosaurus had different cranial proportions again, partly shaped by the hollow crests above and behind their eyes. These animals shared dental batteries, but their feeding mechanics and skull strength were not identical. Recent biomechanical work comparing different hadrosaur skulls suggests that lineages could solve feeding stresses in different ways. One species might have a skull better suited to resisting particular loads, while another relied on a different pattern of muscle force and bone reinforcement. The family was not one uniform grazing machine repeated under different crests. It contained specialists and generalists within the same broad design. At ground level, the vegetation changed through the late Cretaceous. Flowering plants had already diversified, but they did not instantly replace conifers, cycads, ferns, and other older groups. Floodplains held mixtures. Leaves from broad-leaved angiosperms fell beside conifer twigs. Ferns colonized disturbed sediment after floods and fires. Horsetails lined channels. The menu varied by region, season, and the age of the plant community. Picture the edge of a river after a spring flood. Fresh silt covers last year's leaves. Ferns are unfolding across the open ground. Young shrubs send new shoots above the mud. A hadrosaur lowers its beak and pulls a branch sideways. The keratin edge cuts through stems. The tongue moves the mouthful back. Deep inside the cheek, rows of teeth close and begin to grind. That sound would not be loud from a distance, but within a feeding group, it would be constant. Beaks clipping, leaves tearing, jaws working, feet shifting through litter, breath passing through nostrils, and, in crested species, through long internal passages. Insects move through the plants around them. Small branches crack under forefeet. Feeding was not a single dramatic act. It occupied much of the day. Fossilized stomach contents and coprolites provide rare direct evidence of diet, though each specimen must be interpreted cautiously. Plant fragments preserved with hadrosaur remains have included needles, twigs, bark, seeds, and other material from the surrounding environment. Coprolites from late Cretaceous deposits contain heavily processed plant matter, including decayed wood. Some coprolites also preserve fragments of crustacean shell. This does not turn hadrosaurs into active predators, and it does not mean every species regularly sought animal prey. The evidence shows that at least some large herbivorous dinosaurs consumed rotten wood containing crustaceans, perhaps deliberately, perhaps while feeding on nutrient-rich decaying material. The behavior may have been seasonal and could have provided protein or calcium during reproduction, but that interpretation remains uncertain. Herbivory is not always absolute. Living deer eat bird eggs. Cattle may consume small animals accidentally with vegetation. Tortoises sometimes take carrion. A hadrosaur could remain ecologically herbivorous while occasionally swallowing invertebrates or other animal matter. The important point is not that it broke a dietary rule. The important point is that the fossil record preserves a more complex feeding ecology than labels usually allow. The coprolite itself is a concrete object, often rounded or irregular, filled with fragments too small to identify without microscopes and chemical analysis. It is not visually impressive beside a complete skull, yet it carries information the skull cannot. Teeth reveal what an animal could process. Fossil dung reveals at least one meal that passed through the body. Dental microwear provides another scale of evidence. Under magnification, the chewing surfaces carry pits and scratches formed shortly before death. Their orientation helps reconstruct jaw movement. Their density and texture can suggest whether the animal was processing softer leaves, tougher stems, abrasive material, or a mixed diet. Because microwear records a relatively short interval, it can vary between individuals and seasons. Juveniles sometimes show different wear from adults. Smaller hadrosaurs had lower feeding envelopes, smaller guts, and greater nutritional demands for growth. They may have selected softer, more digestible vegetation, while adults accepted coarser and more fibrous plants. This would reduce direct competition between young and mature members of the same species, even if they traveled in the same broader population. The difference between a hatchling and a 10-meter adult was not simply scale. It was a change in ecology. A young animal saw the floodplain from below the fern canopy. It could not reach the same branches, process the same volume, or survive the same period without food. Its predators were different. Its preferred shelter was different. As the skeleton grew, the animal entered new feeding zones and new relationships with the landscape. Hadrosaurs could feed on all fours at heights of roughly 2 meters, depending on species and body size. By rising onto the hind limbs, some could reach several meters higher. This did not make them high browsers comparable to long-necked sauropods, but it expanded their feeding envelope. A single adult could crop low plants, strip shrubs, and reach branches above the back of a smaller herbivore. Stand beside an Edmontosaurus skeleton, and the skull may seem modest compared with the length of the body. But that head controlled access to an immense flow of energy. Every day, vegetation entered through the bill, crossed a dental surface built from hundreds of teeth, and moved into a gut large enough to sustain several tons of muscle, bone, organs, and skin. The efficiency of the system helps explain abundance. A landscape can support only as many herbivores as its plant growth allows. Hadrosaurs did not create more vegetation, but they became extremely effective at harvesting what existed. They could use mixed plant communities, tolerate abrasion through continuous tooth replacement, and move between feeding heights without changing the basic body plan. Efficiency also tied them to water and movement. A large fermenting herbivore needs regular access to food and moisture. Drought could concentrate animals around shrinking channels. Fire could remove old growth and later create fresh vegetation. Floods could destroy a feeding ground in hours and rebuild another with new sediment. Herds may have followed these changes across broad territories rather than remaining in one valley throughout the year. A worn tooth falls from the battery and disappears into mud. Another moves upward to replace it. The animal continues feeding without interruption. Over a lifetime, the jaws pass through generation after generation of teeth, each one used until the grinding surface consumes it. In fossil deposits, isolated hadrosaur teeth are common because the system produced and discarded so many. Hold one of those teeth between two fingers, and the empire becomes small enough to see all at once. A narrow crown, a ridge along its surface, an edge polished by plants. It belonged to a battery that no longer exists, in a jaw that returned to sediment, inside an animal that spent years turning Cretaceous vegetation into movement. The tooth is only a fragment, but the wear on it still follows the direction of the final meals. The jaws explain how hadrosaurs fed, but the rest of the skeleton explains how they carried that feeding system through the world. An adult hadrosaur was a large animal with a deep body, strong pelvis, muscular hind limbs, and forelimbs that could support substantial weight. The result was neither a permanent biped nor a conventional quadruped. It was an animal able to shift between both forms of movement. A row of vertebrae runs through the back and into the tail. Along many of these bones, ossified tendons form a lattice of stiffened tissue. In life, the tendons helped resist bending and supported the spine against the forces created by walking, feeding, and the weight of the abdomen. They did not make the body rigid, but they limited wasteful motion and allowed the tail to function as a stable counterbalance. The tail is deeper than it appears in older skeletal drawings. Long neural spines and chevrons provided attachment for powerful muscles above and below the vertebrae. These muscles began around the pelvis and extended backward, but they also connected mechanically to the hind limbs. In dinosaurs, the main muscles pulling the leg backward were anchored partly in the tail, making the base of the tail an engine for locomotion. This means that a living hadrosaur would not have looked like a skeleton covered by a thin layer of skin. The hips and tail base were thick with muscle. The abdomen expanded below the spine. Soft tissue filled the spaces around the shoulder and neck. Skin crossed the outlines of the ribs rather than sinking between each bone. Mummified specimens repeatedly show that the living profile was fuller and more complex than the mounted frame. The hind limbs carried 3 main weight-bearing toes. Each ended not in a sharp claw, but in a broad terminal structure suited to supporting weight. Trackways show fleshy pads beneath the foot. The ankle and lower leg were built for forward movement, while the femur and pelvis absorbed the forces of a body that could weigh several tons. The forelimbs were shorter and more lightly built, but they were not weak. The upper arm connected to a strong shoulder girdle. The radius and ulna formed a stable forearm. The hand lost the grasping freedom of earlier ornithopods and became a compact support. The central fingers were bound together within soft tissue, forming a column-like unit that contacted the ground through a pad. New exceptionally preserved Edmontosaurus specimens described in the 2020s have added detail to this picture, including keratinous hoof-like coverings on the weight-bearing digits. These structures are not identical to mammal hooves in their evolutionary origin, but they served similar mechanical purposes by protecting the ends of the toes and helping distribute force across firm ground. For decades, the hands of hadrosaurs were reconstructed with separate fingers and broad webs, as though the animals paddled through lakes. Better fossils showed that the tissue between the digits was part of a weight-bearing mitten, not a swimming membrane. The old image came from real evidence, but the interpretation followed the expectation that a duck-billed animal must have been aquatic. Paleontology often advances this way. A fossil is found. Its shape is compared with something familiar. A plausible story forms around it. Later discoveries preserve another part of the body, and the story must change. The earlier scientists were not foolish. They were working with incomplete animals. Hadrosaurs remind us how much of any dinosaur is reconstructed from absence. Trackways preserve the hand as a smaller print in front of the hindfoot. In some sequences, only hindprints appear, which may indicate bipedal movement or simply poor preservation of the lighter forefeet. In others, the front and rear impressions alternate regularly, showing a steady quadrupedal walk. Stride length and track spacing suggest that most recorded movement was unhurried. Walking slowly does not mean being incapable of speed. Most animals spend far more time walking than running, so most trackways should record ordinary travel. Hadrosaurs had large hind limbs and could probably accelerate when threatened. Whether the fastest gait was fully bipedal, partly supported by the forelimbs, or varied with species and size remains debated, but rising onto two legs would have reduced the load on the shorter arms during rapid movement. An adult turning away from a predator would first shift its center of mass. The head and forequarters would lift. The tail would counterbalance the change. Muscles along the pelvis and tail would drive the hind limbs through longer strides. The motion would not resemble a kangaroo hopping upright. The spine remained more horizontal, the body projected forward, and the tail extended behind as a stabilizing beam. Size offered protection, but not immunity. A 12-meter Edmontosaurus approached the length of a large tyrannosaur and carried more body mass than many predators. Yet it lacked horns, a tail club, or heavy armor. Its defense depended on awareness, numbers, endurance, powerful legs, and the difficulty of bringing down a healthy adult without being kicked or struck by the body. The forelimbs also affected feeding. On all fours, the head could move through low vegetation with minimal effort. Rising bipedally lifted the mouth into shrubs and lower branches. The animal could brace with the tail and hind limbs, pull vegetation inward, then return to a quadrupedal stance to travel. Flexibility and posture expanded the usable landscape without requiring a long neck. Along a forest edge, a group of hadrosaurs might feed at several levels at once. Adults crop branches above the ferns. Subadults work through shrubs. Small juveniles remain close to the ground, selecting fresh shoots. Each body occupies a slightly different vertical world, even though the animals stand within a few meters of one another. The neck was muscular and more mobile near the skull than at the base. It could lower the beak, sweep the head sideways, and lift it high enough for display or vigilance. In crested species, the head carried additional bone, but the crests were largely hollow and would have been lighter than their size suggests. Even so, neck muscles had to control them during walking and social movement. Soft tissue altered the head as well. Edmontosaurus fossils have preserved a fleshy comb above the skull in at least one specimen, demonstrating that some hadrosaurs carried external ornaments not predicted by bone alone. Other recently described mummified individuals preserve a midline crest or ridge continuing along the neck and body, then changing into raised structures over the tail. These findings complicate the familiar division between flat-headed and crested hadrosaurs. A skull without a bony crest may still have supported a prominent soft tissue display. Keratin, skin, fat, connective tissue, and color could transform the profile. The bones provide limits and attachment surfaces, but they do not preserve every feature that another hadrosaur would have seen. Color remains almost entirely unknown. Hadrosaur skin impressions usually preserve texture rather than pigment. Some regions show small rounded scales, larger polygonal scales, or patterned clusters, but pattern in scale size is not the same as color pattern. Reconstructions may reasonably use camouflage, stripes, patches, or display colors. Yet most specific choices are artistic possibilities rather than fossil facts. The skin was scaly, but not uniform. Mummies preserve mosaics of small tubercles across the body, with larger scales arranged in particular areas. The texture could change over the flank, limbs, neck, and tail. There is no evidence that adult hadrosaurs were covered in feathers. Their ornithopod ancestry and preserved skin support an external covering dominated by scales, although small filamentous structures cannot be absolutely excluded in every early relative. A dinosaur mummy is rarely a body with original flesh sealed intact. More often, it is a mineral or sedimentary record of the external surface. Skin may leave an impression in surrounding sediment, or a thin clay film may form over the decomposing carcass and preserve its contours. Chemical replacement can retain microscopic structure without preserving the original organic material. The famous Edmontosaurus specimen, known as Dakota, preserves broad areas of skin in 3 dimensions. Another specimen examined in 2022 helped show how a carcass could be scavenged, opened, dried, and later buried while still retaining patches of resistant skin and nails. This offered an alternative to the old assumption that mummification required an untouched body to dry and then be buried almost immediately. Scavengers may have made preservation possible. Bite marks and openings in the body allowed fluids and gases to escape, reducing the expansion that normally tears a carcass apart. The skin dried around the skeleton. Later sediment covered what remained. The process was destructive in one sense, but it produced a fossil that retained more of the animal's outline than rapid burial alone might have done. A dry carcass lies on a Cretaceous point bar. The river has shifted away, leaving sand exposed beneath the sun. Beetles and small vertebrates work around the body. Larger scavengers pull at the abdomen. Skin tightens over the ribs and limbs. Days or weeks later, a flood returns, coating the remains with fine sediment that enters the empty body cavity and presses against the outer surface. Millions of years later, a preparator removes that sediment, grain by grain. The boundary between rock and skin texture may be only a change in color or a thin mineral film. A careless tool stroke could erase a scale pattern that survived the end of the Cretaceous. Exceptional fossils demand slowness because the information is often more fragile than the bone. The mummies reveal that the hand pad was compact and that the body carried soft structures absent from most skeletons. They also show how deceptive a complete skeleton can be. A mounted hadrosaur may appear fully known because nearly every bone is present, but the visible animal was built as much from tissues that decayed as from tissues that fossilized. Consider the space between the ribs. In life, it held lungs, air sacs, liver, gut, blood vessels, reproductive organs, fat, and connective tissue. None of these usually leave clear outlines. The digestive system alone may have weighed hundreds of kilograms when full. The mounted skeleton is an internal scaffold. The animal was a moving ecosystem of organs and microbes supported around it. Breathing in dinosaurs likely involved air sacs and a flow-through respiratory system related to that of birds, though the direct evidence is stronger in Saurischian dinosaurs than in ornithischians. Hadrosaurs lacked the extensive skeletal pneumaticity seen in many theropods and sauropods. Their respiratory anatomy must therefore be reconstructed more cautiously from the shared biology of archosaurs and the demands of an active, large-bodied animal. Bone histology indicates rapid growth and physiology, unlike that of slow-growing modern reptiles. Hadrosaurs laid down highly vascularized bone during juvenile stages, meaning blood vessels penetrated tissues that were forming quickly. Growth slowed as adulthood approached, leaving changes in bone structure that allow paleontologists to estimate age and life history. An adult body could be enormous, but it began inside an egg smaller than the skull it would eventually carry. The young had to add mass rapidly while avoiding predators and competing for food. That growth required oxygen, protein, minerals, and constant energy. The limbs changed proportion as the animal matured, and the skeleton remodeled itself under increasing weight. A hadrosaur could increase from a hatchling measured in tens of centimeters to an animal longer than a city bus in little more than a decade, depending on species. The exact growth curves differ, but the general pace was fast. The empire renewed itself through animals that did not remain small for long. Locomotion changed with that growth. A juvenile's limbs were relatively slender and its body light. It could maneuver through vegetation unavailable to an adult. A mature animal moved with greater momentum and lower acceleration, but also with longer strides and far more endurance in ordinary travel. Herd structure may have balanced these different abilities by keeping young near larger animals or separating age groups at certain times. The tracks of adults and juveniles together do not tell us whether the same individuals stayed together for years. They record proximity at one moment. Bone beds can mix seasons, floods, and repeated occupations. Yet when several kinds of evidence point toward group movement, nesting colonies, age structure, and communication, social behavior becomes the most reasonable explanation, even if its exact form remains beyond reach. At the edge of a track site, one print retains the texture of the footpad. Fine ridges cross the surface where skin met mud. The animal lifted its weight, moved forward, and left that detail behind without knowing it. A body reconstructed from bones becomes more specific at that point. It had a padded foot. It pressed downward. It carried weight through living tissue that flexed around the toes. The print is not a picture of the whole animal, but it is contact. For a fraction of a second, the hadrosaur and the ground shaped one another. The mud rose around the pad. The pad flattened against the mud. Then the foot moved on, and the landscape kept the form of what had touched it. To understand why hadrosaurs became so abundant, it helps to step away from the skeleton and look across the continents they inhabited. The late Cretaceous was warm, but it was not uniform. Rainfall changed with latitude and distance from the sea. Rivers crossed plains that could be humid for part of the year and dry for another. Forests grew beside open wetlands, coastal marshes, volcanic uplands, and broad interior basins. Sea level was high. In North America, the western interior seaway divided the continent into western Laramidia and eastern Appalachia for much of the late Cretaceous. Hadrosaurs lived on both sides, though the western record is far richer because exposed rocks and long histories of collecting have made those ecosystems easier to study. Laramidia was a long, relatively narrow landmass between the seaway and rising mountains to the west. Rivers flowed eastward from uplands into low coastal plains. Sediment accumulated rapidly, burying plants and animals and creating formations that now stretch across Montana, Alberta, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, and northern Mexico. The Dinosaur Park Formation of Alberta records one of the best-known hadrosaur worlds. Around 76 to 74 million years ago, its rivers meandered across a humid coastal plain not far from the seaway. The climate was warm and seasonal. Floods shifted channels. Forests contained conifers, flowering trees and shrubs, ferns, and aquatic plants. Crocodilians occupied the water. Turtles were common. Small mammals and lizards lived beneath the vegetation. Several hadrosaur species lived in the region across relatively short intervals of geological time. Corythosaurus, Lambeosaurus, Parasaurolophus, Gryposaurus, and Prosaurolophus are among the best known, though they did not all occur in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. Fossil formations compress long successions into names, and careless reconstructions can combine species separated by hundreds of thousands of years. Even with that caution, hadrosaur diversity was high. Different skull shapes suggest different visual signals and perhaps different calls. Differences in muzzle form, tooth wear, and skull mechanics suggest variation in feeding. The floodplain could support several large duck-billed species because they were not ecological copies of one another. Modern grasslands can hold zebras, wildebeest, gazelles, buffalo, and antelope because each uses the landscape differently. Some crop short growth, others take taller stems or browse shrubs. Some migrate. Some remain near water. Hadrosaur communities may have worked through comparable partitioning, though the plants, digestive systems, and seasonal patterns were entirely Cretaceous. Farther south, The Kaiparowitz Formation of Utah records a landscape around 76 million years ago near the western shoreline of the Seaway. Rivers crossed a low coastal plain with wetlands and dense vegetation. Hadrosaurs lived alongside horned dinosaurs with elaborate frills, armored ankylosaurs, small ornithopods, crocodilians, turtles, and large tyrannosaurs. The fossil diversity in these southern regions has challenged the older idea that the same dinosaur species ranged freely along all of Laramidia. Mountains, rivers, climate belts, and coastal environments may have divided populations, producing regional faunas. A hadrosaur living in what is now Utah might have belonged to a lineage distinct from one in Alberta, even though no ocean separated them. The Cerro del Pueblo Formation of northern Mexico adds another part of the picture. Around 72 million years ago, the region was not desert. It lay near a tropical or subtropical coast, with estuaries, rivers, humid vegetation, and storms moving inland from the sea. Hadrosaurs there included forms with skulls unlike those farther north, supporting the idea of strong regional diversity. Coahuilosaurus, named in 2024 from material previously assigned to another genus, had a massive downturned lower jaw and unusual structures along the front of the palate. These features may indicate specialized feeding on tough vegetation. The fossil does not preserve a complete life history, but it shows how much hidden diversity can remain in museum collections under familiar labels. A specimen can sit for decades in a cabinet, identified according to the best comparison available at the time. New species are not always found by discovering a new quarry. Sometimes they appear when old bones are measured again, scanned, compared with newly known skulls, and recognized as a combination never seen before. Regional endemism in dinosaurs remains debated because the fossil record is patchy. A species may appear absent from one region simply because the correct rocks are buried or eroded away. Taxonomic differences can also be exaggerated when specimens preserve different growth stages. Still, repeated discoveries from Mexico and the American Southwest suggest that southern hadrosaur communities were not just northern faunas moved down a map. Climate influenced vegetation, and vegetation influenced the herds. Coastal plains could be highly productive, but they were also unstable. Tropical storms pushed seawater inland. Rivers flooded. Channels cut through nesting grounds. Droughts lowered water tables and concentrated animals around remaining pools. Volcanic ash from distant eruptions settled across forests and entered the sedimentary record as thin layers useful for dating fossils. A flood that fed the plain could also kill. Animals trapped in channels drowned or became mired along soft banks. Carcasses accumulated in bends, log jams, and abandoned channels. Bones separated as bodies decayed. Later floods moved and sorted them, producing bone beds that may represent one catastrophic event or many seasons of death gathered into the same deposit. Hadrosaur bone beds are often dominated by one species, which can support the interpretation of group living. But taphonomy matters. A river can concentrate similar bones by size and density. A drought can draw many animals of one habitat toward the same water source. A nesting colony can produce repeated mortality in a limited area. The fossil pattern is biological and geological at the same time. East of the Seaway, hadrosaurs inhabited Appalachia, though their record is more fragmentary. Hadrosaurus folkii from New Jersey is the most famous. Other remains occur in marine deposits because carcasses washed from coastal land into the sea. A bone found among shells and shark teeth does not mean the dinosaur lived offshore. It may record a river carrying part of a terrestrial animal beyond the beach. The eastern landmass had been separated from the west for millions of years, allowing distinct lineages to persist. Appalachia likely held forests, coastal plains, and river systems comparable in broad structure to those of Laramidia, but its dinosaur communities remain less complete. Most of the landscape is covered by younger sediment, vegetation, and cities. Somewhere beneath roads and buildings along the Atlantic coast, Cretaceous channels still hold fragments of that world. A tooth in dark marl. A vertebra worn by transport. A limb bone surrounded by marine fossils. Each piece crossed from land to sea before it entered the geological record. Across Asia, hadrosaurs occupied enormous basins from Mongolia and China to the Russian Far East. The environments ranged from semi-arid floodplains to humid coastal lowlands and volcanic landscapes. Some formations preserve articulated skeletons buried rapidly. Others contain broad bone beds representing herds or repeated accumulations. The Nemegt Formation of Mongolia records river systems and relatively moist habitats near the end of the Cretaceous. Saurolophus shared the landscape with the giant ornithomimosaur, Dinocaris, armored dinosaurs, titanosaurs, and Tarbosaurus, a close Asian relative of Tyrannosaurus. Hadrosaur bones there preserve bite marks and feeding traces left by large predators and scavengers. Farther east, the Amur region of Russia and northeastern China has produced lambeosaurines such as Olorodoton and Amurasaurus. The rocks record floodplains influenced by volcanic activity. Ash and sediment could bury animals quickly, while river transport created dense concentrations of bone. The high-latitude environment experienced long seasonal changes in daylight, even under a warmer global climate. Polar hadrosaurs are among the strongest evidence that dinosaur physiology and behavior cannot be explained by simple comparisons with modern reptiles. Fossils and tracks occur in Alaska at paleolatitudes above the Arctic Circle. These animals lived with months of reduced light, cool seasons, and vegetation shaped by extreme annual cycles. The Prince Creek Formation of northern Alaska preserves hadrosaur remains, including juveniles, suggesting that at least some populations reproduced at high latitude rather than migrating there only during summer. Whether all adults stayed year-round is harder to determine. Some may have moved regionally, but the presence of very young animals makes continent-spanning seasonal migrations unnecessary. Winter in the Cretaceous Arctic was not the ice-locked darkness of modern Alaska, but it was still dark for extended periods. Temperatures dropped. Plant growth slowed or stopped. Deciduous conifers and other plants shed leaves. Rivers froze, at least locally. Hadrosaurs had to endure scarcity, store energy, change diet, move to sheltered areas, or combine several strategies. Bone histology from polar dinosaurs suggests active growth, and track sites preserve group movement. The animals may have used fat reserves and fed on bark, twigs, evergreen foliage, and stored plant matter under snow or leaf litter. These possibilities are difficult to test directly, but the fossils prove that hadrosaurs extended far beyond permanently lush coastal plains. Their empire was not built on one ideal climate. It was built on flexibility. A lineage that could only survive in warm swamps would not reach Arctic Alaska, Mediterranean islands, Patagonian river valleys, and Moroccan coastal environments. Hadrosaurs succeeded because the basic body plan could be adjusted to many ecological settings. Europe presented a different challenge. During much of the late Cretaceous, high sea levels divided the region into an archipelago. Islands varied in size and isolation. Dinosaur populations arrived through temporary land connections, island chains, or rare dispersal events, then evolved separately. Some became smaller than their mainland relatives, a pattern associated with limited resources. Island dwarfism is not automatic, and body size estimates from incomplete skeletons can be uncertain. Yet hadrosauroids, such as Tethyschodros from Italy and Telmatosaurus from Romania, show distinctive combinations of primitive features and modest size. Their environments differed from the immense floodplains of western North America, and their evolution followed local constraints. The Hague region of Romania was part of a Cretaceous island, where several dinosaur lineages became unusually small. Rivers crossed a seasonally dry landscape influenced by volcanism. Nests, eggs, bones, and paleosols preserve a fauna isolated within the European archipelago. Telmatosaurus was not a tiny animal by human standards, but beside giant mainland hadrosaurs, it belonged to another scale. Near the end of the Cretaceous, hadrosaurids also reached places once thought inaccessible. Lambeosaurines appear in North Africa, where open water separated the land from Europe. Hadrosauroids lived in southern South America and Antarctica. Their distribution suggests that land bridges, island hopping, rafting, swimming, or some combination allowed these large animals to cross barriers more often than older maps implied. A broad river is easy to imagine. An ocean crossing is harder. Yet living large mammals sometimes swim between islands, and storms can carry groups on floating vegetation. The fossil record does not show the journey, it shows descendants on the other side. Biogeography begins with that fact and works backward through the possible routes. Continents were never fixed stages under the dinosaurs. Plates moved, seas opened, mountain belts rose, and coastlines shifted through the millions of years hadrosaurs existed. A route available to one generation could disappear later. Populations separated by water could evolve independently, then meet again when sea level fell or land emerged. This movement helps explain both similarity and difference. A Moroccan lambeosaur can resemble European relatives because its ancestors came from that broader lineage. It can also evolve a smaller body and unique jaw features after isolation. A South American hadrosaur can carry anatomical evidence of northern ancestry while becoming part of a southern ecosystem filled with titanosaurs and megaraptoran predators. By the final few million years of the Cretaceous, duck-billed dinosaurs occupied a geographic range that approached global. They did not dominate every herbivore community, and in some southern regions, they remained uncommon beside long-established local groups. But they had crossed enough barriers and entered enough habitats to become one of the widest-ranging large dinosaur families on Earth. At a cliff face, these worlds appear as bands: gray mudstone from a floodplain, sandstone from a channel, coal from a swamp, bentonite from volcanic ash, marine shale from the advancing sea. The hadrosaur bones lie inside this sequence, sometimes complete, sometimes scattered, each one positioned within the changing geography that shaped the animal's life. The empire is visible not as a border on a map, but as repeated contact between bone and sediment across continents. A jaw in Alberta, a crest in China, a tooth in Antarctica, a partial skull in Morocco, a trackway in Alaska. Separate pieces, separated by oceans and by millions of years, all carrying variations of the same broad design. A lambeosaurine skull can be recognized before the teeth are visible. Above the eyes, the bones rise into a structure that may resemble a helmet, an axe blade, a rounded fan, or a long tube sweeping backward over the neck. These crests are among the most elaborate head ornaments produced by any land vertebrate, and much of their interior is empty space shaped into passages for air. The crest did not sit on top of the skull like a horn attached after the rest of the head evolved. It was built from the facial bones themselves, especially the premaxillae and nasals. The nostrils opened near the front of the snout, but the nasal passages traveled upward and backward through the crest before curving toward the throat. In some species, air followed a long and complicated route. Cretaceous carried a high rounded crest often compared with a cassowary's casque, though the resemblance is only external. Lambeosaurus developed a crest with a forward-leaning plate and a backward projection. Hypacrosaurus had a tall crest rising above the rear of the skull, paired with elongated neural spines along the back. Parasaurolophus extended the system into a tube that could exceed 1 meter in length. Each shape varied through growth. Juveniles began with small structures and simpler internal passages. As the skull matured, the crest expanded and the route through the nasal cavity lengthened. This ontogeny is important because small crested fossils once received separate genus names before researchers recognized that some represented younger stages of known lambeosaurines. Growth does not explain every variation. Closely related species truly had different crests, and adults within one species may have differed by sex, age, or individual condition. Demonstrating sexual dimorphism in extinct animals is difficult because large samples are rare and growth can imitate sex-based difference. Many confident older claims have therefore been reduced to possibilities. The external shape was certainly visible. In a group containing several hadrosaur species, a crest could help animals recognize their own kind at a distance. Its profile changed with age, allowing mature individuals and juveniles to appear different. Color or soft tissue may have increased the contrast, although the fossils do not preserve the pattern. Species recognition sounds less dramatic than combat, but it matters in a crowded ecosystem. Mating with the wrong species wastes reproductive effort. Following the wrong group can lead an animal away from suitable habitat. A distinctive head shape provides immediate information before scent or close contact becomes possible. Display may also have influenced mate choice and social status. A large, healthy crest could signal age and condition because it required years of growth and an intact skull. Yet the bone is too thin in many places to function as a heavy impact weapon. Lambeosaurines probably did not use their crests like the horns of fighting bovids. The hollow interior offers another function: sound. Air moving through a long tube resonates at frequencies determined by the tube's length and shape. Computer models of Parasaurolophus nasal passages produce low tones, supporting the idea that the crest modified vocalizations. The exact voice depends on soft tissues that are not preserved, but the crest almost certainly affected sound passing through it. A long tube favors lower resonant frequencies. Adult Parasaurolophus may therefore have produced deep calls that carried through forest and across open floodplain. Juveniles with shorter crests would resonate at higher frequencies. As the animal grew, its voice may have lowered, making age audible as well as visible. The sound need not have been a roar. It may have resembled a horn, a booming call, or a low resonant bellow shaped by lungs, throat, mouth, and nasal passages. Any modern recreation is an experiment, not a recording from the past. Still, the physical principles are real. Air moved through those tubes in life, and the tubes could not avoid modifying it. In dense vegetation, sound reaches where vision fails. A herd spread through trees might remain in contact through low calls. Mothers and young could identify one another. Adults might signal alarm, readiness to move, or competition. The number of possible messages is large, but fossils cannot translate them. Before dawn, mist lies over a Cretaceous river. The herd is partly hidden beyond a belt of conifers. A low note begins somewhere in the gray forest, more felt through the ground and chest than heard as a sharp sound. Another answers farther away. The calls do not reveal words, only presence. The group remains connected, while individuals feed out of sight. The inner ear of hadrosaurs can be reconstructed from the bony labyrinth inside the skull. Studies of Lambeosaurines indicate sensitivity suited to low-frequency sound, consistent with the acoustic role of the crest. The brain regions associated with hearing and sensory processing were well developed enough to support a complex auditory environment. Hadrosaur brains were not human-like, and brain size alone does not reveal intelligence. Endocasts show enlarged cerebral hemispheres relative to many other dinosaurs, but much of the brain's function cannot be mapped directly from volume. Social behavior, navigation, memory, and communication may all have required substantial processing without producing anything comparable to human thought. The crest was probably multifunctional. It could be seen and heard. It may have helped condition inhaled air or influenced heat exchange, though thermoregulation alone does not easily explain the diversity of shapes. Evolution often preserves structures that serve several roles at once, especially when display and communication reinforce one another. Parasaurolophus is the most extreme example. Its crest extends backward like a long, curved pipe, with internal passages looping from the nostrils toward the tip and back into the skull. The structure lengthens the head dramatically, without adding solid bone through its entire volume. From the side, the animal's silhouette is unmistakable. A juvenile Parasaurolophus from Utah, nicknamed Joe, preserves a skull in which the crest is only beginning to develop. The internal anatomy shows that the characteristic tube formed through major changes as the animal grew. The fossil captures the design before completion, a stage rarely visible in adult-focused museum displays. Growth series allow paleontologists to ask when a crest began functioning as a signal. A small juvenile might not need an adult display structure, but it still needed clear airways and perhaps a recognizable call. The crest's visual and acoustic roles could therefore change through life, rather than appearing all at once. Cretaceous bone beds preserve multiple skull sizes, showing the rounded helmet becoming taller and more complex with maturity. Some specimens once called Procheniosaurus are now interpreted as juveniles of crested genera. Taxonomy changed because ontogeny had been mistaken for diversity. This problem appears throughout dinosaur paleontology. Young animals can have shorter faces, larger eye sockets, unfused bones, and undeveloped ornaments. If only one juvenile and one adult are known, they may look like different species. Histology, growth sequences, and large samples help separate genuine diversity from stages of the same animal. Lambeosaurus adds another complication because crest shape can vary between specimens that may represent species, sexes, growth stages, or a combination. The crest has a tall blade and a rearward spike, creating an outline more angular than that of Cretaceous. Early reconstructions sometimes exaggerated soft tissue between the projections, but the preserved bone gives no certainty about the complete external contour. The common division between Lambeosaurines and Saurolophines is useful, but it should not become a division between noisy crested animals and silent flat-headed ones. Saurolophines had nasal chambers, throats, lungs, and social lives too. Some carried solid crests or enlarged noses that could have supported soft tissue resonators. Edmontosaurus preserved a fleshy comb, suggesting that visual display extended far beyond hollow crests. Saurolophus had a solid spike projecting from the back of the skull, with a depression around its base that may have supported a soft tissue structure. Gryposaurus carried a high-arched nasal boss. Cretaceous and related forms had modified nasal regions. Brachylophosaurus bore a flat paddle-like crest. None contained the long looping tubes of Parasaurolophus, but all changed the visible face. Hadrosaur skulls show a family investing heavily in communication. The energy required to grow a crest was small compared with maintaining the whole body, but the developmental precision was high. Nasal passages had to remain open. Bone walls had to resist daily stresses. The structure had to grow without blocking breathing or weakening the skull. The visual landscape of a hadrosaur herd may therefore have been unusually rich. Different ages carried different profiles. Individuals recognized familiar shapes. Mature animals displayed structures that could signal species, status, or reproductive condition. Movement of the head changed the angle and apparent size of the crest, much as living birds use posture to transform static ornaments into active displays. Communication leaves indirect evidence. A resonating chamber supports sound production. A large visual ornament supports display. Herding and nesting support frequent social contact. None of these alone proves a specific call or ritual, but together they make a silent, socially indifferent hadrosaur less plausible than an animal using several channels of information. The crest could also have affected breathing during exertion. Air traveled through extended passages before reaching the lungs, and mucous membranes would have warmed, humidified, and filtered it. Whether this provided a major physiological advantage is uncertain. The same passages may simply have carried the cost of a communication structure whose benefits lay elsewhere. Crests also made the head vulnerable to injury. A fracture could damage airways or introduce infection. Yet severe crest injuries are not common enough to suggest routine violent combat. The structures were built to survive normal life, collisions with vegetation, social contact, and the forces of movement, not repeated head-on impacts. A skull found flattened in shale can distort the crest until the internal passages are almost unreadable. Modern computed tomography allows researchers to see through the rock, separate bone from matrix, and trace the airway digitally. The fossil remains in place while the internal architecture becomes visible on a screen. A CT model of Parasaurolophus can be rotated, sliced, and measured without cutting the original skull. Researchers can send virtual air through reconstructed tubes, estimate resonance, and compare juvenile and adult anatomy. Technology does not remove uncertainty, but it opens structures that preparation tools cannot reach. The process begins with a physical object, a skull collected from a badlands slope, plaster around fragile bone, sediment inside the crest, cracks filled by minerals. Digital reconstruction must correct deformation carefully because a tube squeezed after burial will produce a different acoustic result from the tube in life. Every simulated sound therefore rests on geological interpretation. The model depends on the skull's original shape. The original shape depends on restoring crushed bone. The restored bone depends on anatomy from related specimens. The result can be informative without being exact. Even so, a low-resonant call across a floodplain is not fantasy detached from evidence. It is a reasonable consequence of a long hollow airway, a large animal capable of moving substantial air, an ear suited to lower frequencies, and a social ecology in which long-distance contact would be useful. The animal lifts its head above the shrubs. The crest catches the last light along one edge. Breath moves from the lungs, through the throat, and into passages that turn inside the bone. The call leaves the nostrils and spreads over the river. Nearby animals stop feeding for a moment. Farther away, another crest rises above the vegetation. A crest fossilized in isolation cannot preserve that response. It remains a hollow shape filled with stone, yet its complexity points beyond the individual animal. Teeth are built for food. Limbs are built for movement. A resonating crest makes the most sense in a world where other hadrosaurs were present to see and hear it. In the museum, the skull is silent because the airways are full of sediment and the lungs are gone. The curve of the passage remains. Follow it from the nostril, upward through the crest, around the internal chamber, and back toward the throat. The route ends in stone, but for millions of years it carried breath. Herding is one of the most familiar images associated with hadrosaurs and one of the most difficult behaviors to prove in detail. Skeletons do not preserve companionship. A group of animals can die together without living together permanently. Rivers gather bones. Droughts gather survivors. Predators gather carcasses. Fossil evidence must be separated from the processes that created the deposit. Even with those limits, hadrosaurs provide repeated signs of group life. Monodominant bone beds contain many individuals of one species. Track sites preserve parallel pathways. Nesting grounds place many nests close together. Crests and other display structures suggest frequent communication. Age distributions sometimes show juveniles, subadults, and adults within the same broader population. A bone bed begins as a physical problem. Dozens or thousands of bones lie within one layer. Some are articulated, others are scattered. Teeth may be abundant while small, delicate bones are rare. The orientation of long bones shows how water moved. Weathering cracks indicate how long carcasses lay exposed. Bite marks record scavenging before burial. At a site dominated by Maiasaura, the deposit may represent a catastrophic death assemblage, perhaps caused by volcanic ash, drought, disease, flood, or several stresses acting together. The cause is not always recoverable. What matters is that many animals of similar anatomy were present in the same region close enough in time to enter the same geological event. Hadrosaur bone beds occur across North America, Asia, and other regions. Some contain hundreds of individuals and cover large areas. They suggest local population densities far beyond what isolated skeletons imply. In certain ecosystems, duckbills were not occasional animals passing through. They formed a major share of the large herbivore biomass. High biomass affects everything around it. Vegetation is cropped and trampled. Trails form between water and feeding grounds. Dung returns nutrients to soil. Carcasses feed scavengers. Predators focus on the herd. Insects, fungi, and microbes process waste and remains. Hadrosaurs shaped floodplains even when no dramatic interaction occurred. A herd is not necessarily a single stable society containing every age and sex throughout the year. Living ungulates form and dissolve groups according to season, food, reproduction, and danger. Hadrosaurs may have gathered in large numbers during migration or nesting, then dispersed into smaller feeding units. Some species may have segregated by age. Evidence from Hadrosaurus bone beds has been interpreted as age segregation, with different deposits dominated by different growth stages. This could mean juveniles and adults used separate habitats or formed separate groups for part of life. Such separation would reduce competition and allow young animals to feed where vegetation and cover suited their size. Other track sites contain small, medium, and large footprints moving together, which supports mixed age groups at least at certain moments. These patterns do not conflict. The same species can separate and reunite across a year. Reproductive colonies, winter groups, nursery herds, and ordinary feeding parties could all leave different signatures. Tracks preserve movement more directly than bones. At Denali in Alaska, hadrosaur track sites include impressions from several size classes. The surfaces record animals traveling through a high-latitude environment where seasonal light and temperature strongly affected plant growth. The presence of young tracks supports local breeding and family or nursery structure. Some surfaces are crowded until individual trackways become difficult to follow. Footprints overlap in the same direction. Mud squeezes outward from each step. Later animals cross earlier prints. The result resembles a path used repeatedly by heavy traffic rather than a chance meeting of two individuals. A herd passing through soft sediment does not need to run. Ordinary walking by dozens of adults would produce vibration, broken vegetation, and a deep rhythm of footfalls. Small animals nearby would feel the approach before seeing the bodies. Dust might rise in dry seasons. In wet seasons, the path would become churned mud. Predators could use these pathways too. Tyrannosaurs may have followed herds, tested their edges, or waited near river crossings. A large group offers many eyes, but it also advertises its position. The young, injured, and exhausted remain vulnerable even when surrounded by adults. Hadrosaurs lacked the tightly interlocking horns or armor that would create a simple defensive wall. Their protection may have depended on early warning and coordinated escape. Adults could cluster around juveniles, though no fossil directly shows this. More certainly, a predator approaching a large group faced confusion, moving bodies, and the risk of injury from animals weighing several tons. Population structure can be estimated from fossil abundance only with difficulty. Bone beds overrepresent events that preserve many individuals. Upland animals may rarely fossilize. Small juveniles have fragile bones that disappear during transport. A quarry sample is not a census of the living ecosystem. Still, the repeated dominance of hadrosaur remains in many formations is hard to dismiss. In the Hell Creek Formation, Edmontosaurus is among the most common large dinosaurs. In the Dinosaur Park Formation, multiple hadrosaur species are abundant. In parts of Eastern Asia, enormous bone accumulations show the same pattern. Their populations were resilient enough to persist under continuous predation. Social life would have begun with recognition. A juvenile learns the shapes, smells, movements, and calls of nearby animals. It follows bodies larger than itself through vegetation. It stops when they stop. It moves when the group begins to move. These behaviors leave almost no fossil trace, yet they are ordinary requirements of coordinated group movement. The brain endocast gives only broad support. Enlarged cerebral regions and developed sensory systems are compatible with social behavior and environmental memory. They do not reveal emotional bonds or herd hierarchy. Comparisons with living birds and reptiles show that complex social behavior does not require mammalian brain anatomy. A crocodilian mother can guard a nest and respond to calls from hatchlings. Birds recognize individuals, coordinate movement, defend territories, and maintain long-term associations. Hadrosaurs shared ancestry with birds more closely than with mammals and lived as active archosaurs. Their social possibilities were wider than older images of dull solitary reptiles allowed. Migration is another possibility often attached to herds. Stable isotope studies, bone chemistry, and geographic distribution have been used to investigate seasonal movement in some dinosaurs. But results are mixed. Large hadrosaurs certainly could travel hundreds of kilometers over time. Whether particular populations performed regular long-distance migrations is a species-by-species question. Arctic hadrosaurs need not have migrated to temperate latitudes every winter. Juvenile fossils indicate breeding in the north, and a round trip across thousands of kilometers would be demanding for young animals. Regional movement between coastal plains, river valleys, uplands, and sheltered forests is more plausible for many populations. Seasonal movement could follow food rather than temperature alone. Floodplains produce fresh growth after water recedes. Uplands may remain cooler and greener during dry months. Coastal storms can alter plant communities. A herd that remembers routes between these resources gains an advantage even if it never crosses the continent. The stiffened spine and weight-bearing limbs were suited to sustained walking. Hadrosaurs did not need the high-speed endurance of modern open-country antelope to migrate. A steady pace over weeks would carry them far. Large guts allowed them to process low-quality food along the route, reducing dependence on a single ideal feeding patch. Water crossings were unavoidable in river-dominated landscapes. Hadrosaurs could almost certainly swim when necessary, as most large land animals can. Their powerful hind limbs and buoyant bodies would keep them afloat. This does not make them specialized aquatic dinosaurs. Swimming was one ability within a terrestrial life. A river crossing could create one of the most dangerous moments of the year. Adults enter first or gather along the bank. The current pushes against deep bodies. Juveniles struggle in shallower water or remain between larger animals. Crocodilians wait near the channel margin. Predators approach from behind as the herd compresses. No fossil preserves the crossing itself, but trackways can end at ancient channel edges and reappear elsewhere. Bone accumulations in river deposits may record animals lost in floods. The scene is inferred from landscape and anatomy, not from a single frozen event. Drought produces another kind of gathering. Waterholes shrink. Vegetation around them is stripped. Dung and urine contaminate the remaining pools. Disease spreads more easily among concentrated animals. The weakest die first, and their carcasses attract predators that remain close because new prey arrives each day. A drought bonebed may contain many age groups, repeated trampling, shed teeth, and bones weathered before burial. When rain finally returns, floodwater carries the remains into a channel and covers them. The resulting deposit can resemble the death of a herd in one catastrophe, even though mortality accumulated across months. Taphonomy is the discipline of resisting the easiest story. A dramatic mass death may be correct, but every bone must be asked how it arrived, how long it lay exposed, what moved it, and what was lost. Hadrosaur social behavior becomes strongest where independent evidence agrees despite these filters. Nesting colonies provide that independent line. Repeated nests in the same horizons indicate many breeding animals using a limited area. Trackways with mixed sizes show group movement. Crests support communication. Bone beds show abundance. Together they make social hadrosaurs far more likely than solitary animals that gathered only by accident. Sociality also has costs. Large groups compete for food and water. Disease and parasites spread. movement becomes limited by the slowest members. Calls reveal location to predators. The behavior persists only when benefits such as defense, navigation, reproduction, and information outweigh those costs. Hadrosaurs may have gained particular value from information. A group can discover new feeding patches faster than a lone animal. Individuals follow experienced members through seasonal routes. Alarm spreads rapidly. A juvenile learns which plants are eaten and where water remains during dry periods. None of this requires human-like teaching. Simple attention and following are enough. Across a broad floodplain, several hundred hadrosaurs would transform the horizon. Crests rise above backs in different shapes. Adults move in parallel lines. Dust hangs behind the group. The herd occupies more space than a village, yet it remains only one moving concentration within a population spread across the basin. The soundscape would be layered. Footfalls at close range. Low calls traveling farther. Higher juvenile calls within the group. Branches tearing. Water splashing at crossings. Predators calling from a distance. Insects and birds continuing around the movement. The empire was not silent, and its largest gatherings may have been heard kilometers away. At night, the group settles without becoming still. Some animals feed, others rest with bodies folded above the ground. Heads lift at unfamiliar sounds. Young remain near larger forms. The stars above are arranged almost as they are now, but the constellations have no names, and the mammals beneath the ferns are small enough to hide in a hadrosaur footprint. Resting posture is known only indirectly. Articulated skeletons and trackways can suggest how limbs folded, but sleep behavior does not fossilize. Hadrosaurs may have rested on the ground like large birds and mammals, with the limbs tucked beside the body. Their size made standing rest possible, but prolonged sleep probably required lowering the body. By morning, the herd begins to move. The first animals step onto damp ground, leaving clear impressions. Those behind pass over them until the path becomes a single churned band. Most prints will vanish under the next rain. A few at the edge remain untouched, preserving the size of a juvenile walking beside an adult. In the Two Medicine Formation of Montana, a shallow bowl of sediment holds broken eggshell and the bones of young dinosaurs. The nest is not a dramatic object. Its rim is low. The eggs are crushed. The skeletons are small and incomplete. Yet this ordinary patch of ground changed the way scientists thought about dinosaur families. The hadrosaur was named Maiasaura, often translated as good mother lizard, after nests and juveniles suggested that at least some young remained at the nesting site after hatching. The name carries an interpretation, and interpretations must be tested, but the fossils opened a question that earlier dinosaur science had rarely treated seriously. What happened between the egg and the adult skeleton? Maiasaura lived in western North America during the Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous, roughly 78 to 76 million years ago, according to current dating of the relevant two medicine beds. Adults were large saurolophine hadrosaurs without a hollow crest. Their skulls carried a low solid ridge above the eyes, and their bodies reached several tons. Nesting grounds preserve clusters of circular or bowl-shaped nests spaced across ancient surfaces. The original eggs were about the size of large grapefruits, small compared with the adult that laid them. A clutch contained many eggs arranged within plant material and sediment. The parents probably did not sit directly on the eggs with full body weight. Dinosaur eggs face physical limits. Shell must be thick enough to protect the embryo but porous enough for gas exchange. As egg size increases, the shell and internal diffusion system become difficult to scale. Large dinosaurs therefore did not produce offspring in proportionally enormous eggs. They produced relatively small hatchlings and grew them rapidly after hatching. This created a life history very different from that of large mammals. An elephant gives birth to one highly developed calf after a long pregnancy. A hadrosaur could lay a clutch containing many offspring, most of which would not survive to adulthood. Population success depended on numbers, growth, and repeated reproduction, rather than heavy investment in one large newborn. The Maiasaura nestlings were larger than embryos, but still small enough to fit within the nest depression. Their limb bones showed immature ends and rapidly forming tissue. Early interpretations suggested that they could not walk effectively, and therefore had to be fed by adults. Later research showed that parts of the skeleton were more developed than first assumed, keeping the degree of helplessness under debate. A 2025 study approached the question through bone physiology, estimating neonatal metabolic capacity from the microscopic structure of femora and the size of blood supply openings. The results supported an altricial condition in Maiasaura, with young animals likely dependent on intensive care for a period estimated at roughly 40 to 75 days. This does not prove exactly what the adults did. Feeding could have involved carrying vegetation to the nest, regurgitating processed food, or allowing young to eat plant material gathered nearby. Protection, shading, nest maintenance, and leading hatchlings to suitable food could also count as parental care. No fossil preserves an adult in the act. The evidence does suggest that hadrosaur reproductive strategies were not identical across the family. Hipparchosaurus hatchlings may have been more mobile, and age-segregated bone beds have been used to argue for more precocial young in some Lambeosaurines. A successful global radiation could include several solutions rather than one universal style of parenting. This diversity matters because reproduction connects anatomy to geography. A species whose young remain in a nest for months needs a stable breeding ground, reliable food nearby, and adults able to protect or provision them. A species with mobile hatchlings can reproduce in a different range of environments, but may expose the young to greater immediate risk. The nesting ground itself was reused. Layers of nests suggest repeated return to the same region, perhaps across generations. Site fidelity is common in living birds and reptiles when suitable substrate, drainage, temperature, and food occur together. A hadrosaur colony may have gathered seasonally, nested, raised young, and dispersed before the next year. The breeding plain would look busy rather than peaceful. Adults move between nests. Vegetation is trampled. Soil is opened and piled. Calls pass through the colony. Small predators search for eggs. Insects gather around broken shells and plant matter. A storm can flood low nests. A dry wind can expose eggs to overheating. Eggs attracted danger from the beginning. Mammals, lizards, snakes, small theropods, and other animals could take hatchlings or open nests. Larger predators might patrol the edge of the colony. Communal nesting can overwhelm predators through sheer numbers, but it also concentrates vulnerable food in one place. A nest fails quietly. One embryo stops developing. Another egg cracks too early and dries. Rain fills the depression. Sediment covers part of the clutch. The parent may return or may already be gone. Most reproductive loss leaves almost no trace unless burial follows quickly. Successful hatchlings entered the most dangerous stage of life. Bone histology and population studies of Maiasaura indicate extremely high mortality during the first year. Small bodies were vulnerable to predators, starvation, disease, exposure, and accidents. Those that survived grew rapidly, adding bone at rates supported by dense networks of blood vessels. Growth rings and tissue organization allow paleontologists to reconstruct stages from nestling to juvenile, subadult, and adult. Maiasaura may have reached sexual maturity before full skeletal size, perhaps within a few years, while continuing to grow afterward. Such early reproduction would help compensate for high juvenile mortality. A thin slice cut from a fossil tibia reveals concentric changes under polarized light. Fast-growing woven bone appears disorganized at small scale because collagen and mineral were deposited quickly. Later tissue becomes more orderly. Lines of arrested growth may mark seasonal slowdowns, though not every line corresponds simply to one calendar year. Histology is destructive, so researchers sample carefully, often removing a narrow section from a damaged or less diagnostic part of the bone. The cut surface is copied with a cast, and the specimen is repaired. The information gained includes growth rate, remodeling, vascularity, maturity, and episodes of physiological stress. Some Maiasaura bones contain localized vascular changes interpreted as temporary stress rather than annual cycles. Illness or starvation may have slowed growth, especially during the first year when mortality was highest. The skeleton therefore records not only age but difficult periods survived. Rapid growth does not mean easy growth. A juvenile had to obtain enough energy each day to maintain its body and build new tissue at the same time. Missing several feeding opportunities could matter. Injury could redirect resources from growth to healing. Drought could reduce the soft vegetation young animals preferred. Teeth changed with age as well. Juvenile microwear suggests greater selectivity and different plant processing than in adults. New research published in 2026 has continued examining contrasts between juvenile Maiasaura and adult Hadrosaurs, using wear patterns to investigate whether young animals consumed different foods and what that might imply for parental care. Diet does not identify provisioning by itself. Young animals may select different plants because of body size and digestive limits, even without adults feeding them. But if nestlings remained in place while their teeth show consistent feeding, food had to reach the nesting area somehow. The simplest possibilities include adults bringing plant material, or nests being placed beside abundant low vegetation. Broken eggshell can answer other questions. Shell thickness and pore structure relate to gas exchange and burial conditions. Some dinosaurs covered eggs with sediment or vegetation, allowing heat from the environment or decaying plant matter to support incubation. Hadrosaur nests may have used similar strategies, but behavior could vary among species. Embryos inside eggs preserve proportions before hatching. The skull is short, the limbs are small, teeth may already be developing within the jaws. In Lambeosaurines, the crest is absent or only beginning, showing that the structures defining adults emerged later through growth. An embryo is one of the rarest kinds of dinosaur fossil because several unlikely events must align. The egg must be buried without total destruction. Minerals must enter delicate bones before they decay. The shell must survive pressure. Later erosion must expose the nest without removing it completely. A complete growth series turns a species from one skeleton into a life. The hatchling, juvenile, subadult, and adult no longer appear as separate forms. Limb proportions shift, the skull lengthens, the dental battery expands, the crest rises, bone tissue slows. An animal that began within a small egg becomes one of the largest bodies on the floodplain. Parental care, if present, also changes through that sequence. Intensive nest attendance may last weeks. Group protection may continue longer. Juveniles may join nursery herds before mixing with adults. Older subadults could separate into age-based groups. Each stage requires different behavior from the population around it. The word family can mislead because it suggests a modern human household. Hadrosaurs may have formed temporary associations rather than long-term pairs. One parent may have provided most care, or both may have participated. Colonies could contain related and unrelated animals. Young could follow any nearby adult after leaving the nest. The fossils cannot identify affection. They can identify investment. A nest built and maintained is investment. Eggs placed in suitable substrate are investment. Young surviving in nests beyond hatching suggest continued support. Rapid growth supported by access to food shows that the early weeks were biologically active rather than dormant. Reproductive output helped hadrosaurs recover from predation and environmental loss. A large adult could lay many eggs over multiple seasons. Even when most offspring died, a small fraction reaching maturity was enough to maintain the population. This is the arithmetic behind abundant bone beds and enormous herds. The same strategy carried risk. If a nesting ground failed across a whole season because of flood, ashfall, or drought, an entire year's recruitment could disappear. Repeated sight fidelity could turn a familiar safe location into a trap when the environment changed. Evolution balances past success against future uncertainty without foresight. Volcanic ash was part of the two-medicine world. Fine particles falling over vegetation could contaminate food and water, irritate lungs, and bury nests. Thick ash layers can kill quickly. Thinner, repeated falls can create chronic stress. Bentonite beds in the formation record eruptions, occurring far from the nesting plane, but carried across it by wind. Ash also provides dates. Zircon crystals within volcanic layers contain uranium that decays into lead at known rates. Measuring those isotopes allows geologists to place hadrosaur populations within precise intervals. A destructive event in the Cretaceous becomes a clock for researchers millions of years later. Updated dating has refined the age of the two-medicine formation and the occurrences of Maiasaura. This matters because evolution operates through sequence. To know whether two species interacted, one must first know whether they overlapped. To measure growth or extinction, one must place bones within reliable time. The nest remains local even as the science around it expands. A shallow depression. Eggshell fragments. Tiny limb bones. Sediment containing pollen and plant remains. Each category is studied by different methods, and together they reconstruct a breeding season that lasted only months. Near the end of that season, the juveniles are large enough to leave. Their feet press small three-toed prints around the nest. Some follow adults toward the river, others move within a nursery group. The abandoned bowl fills with wind-blown sediment and plant litter. No one returns until the next breeding cycle. A new nest may be dug nearby, cutting into the edge of the old one. Eggs are laid above bones from earlier young. Flood sediment later seals both levels. Generations become stacked in the ground, close enough to touch, but separated by a year or more of living time. When the rock is opened, the youngest bones are still inside the place where the animal began. They never reached the broad rivers, the migration paths, or the adult herd. Their importance lies in that incompleteness. They preserve the part of dinosaur life that giant mounted skeletons leave out, the weeks when an empire depended on a nest no wider than a room. A tyrannosaur tooth enters the tail of a living hadrosaur and breaks. The tip remains embedded between the vertebrae. Bone begins to grow around it. Infection does not kill the animal. The wound closes, and for months or years the hadrosaur continues to walk with part of its attacker still inside the skeleton. This kind of fossil is unusually direct. Tooth marks on a carcass can be made during hunting or scavenging. A healed wound proves that the bite occurred while the prey was alive, and that it survived long enough for repair. The embedded tooth identifies the kind of predator with rare precision. Tyrannosaurs were the dominant large theropods in many late Cretaceous hadrosaur ecosystems. Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus lived with Campanian duckbills in western North America. Daspletosaurus occupied related environments. Tarbosaurus hunted hadrosaurs in Asia. Near the end of the Cretaceous, Tyrannosaurus shared floodplains with Edmontosaurus. The relationship changed as both lineages evolved. Earlier tyrannosaurids were often more lightly built and may have relied on speed and repeated cutting bites. Later forms developed deeper skulls, thicker teeth, and enormous bite forces capable of crushing bone. Hadrosaurs responded not with armor, but with size, numbers, sensory awareness, and locomotor capacity. A healthy adult Edmontosaurus was not easy prey. It could reach 12 meters or more in length, with a deep torso and powerful hindquarters. Its mass may have rivaled or exceeded that of the predator attacking it. Tyrannosaurus had the stronger weapon, but the prey had momentum, endurance, and the ability to injure with kicks or body impact. Predation is a problem of risk rather than simple superiority. A predator that breaks a leg may starve. Large prey offers more meat, but it also increases the chance of injury. Tyrannosaurs likely selected juveniles, subadults, isolated individuals, and animals weakened by disease or drought when those opportunities existed. Hadrosaur bones preserve several kinds of contact. Deep punctures match tyrannosaur teeth. Long scrapes show teeth dragged across bone. Repeated marks along joints suggest dismemberment. Bite orientation can reveal whether a predator was stripping flesh from a carcass, crushing a limb, or attacking a particular part of the body. A Tarbosaurus-fed hadrosaur from Mongolia preserves selective bite marks around exposed bones, interpreted as scavenging on a partly buried carcass. The predator adjusted its jaw angle to remove remaining tissue rather than simply crushing everything. Large tyrannosaurs were powerful, but their feeding could be controlled and precise. Fossil bite marks rarely distinguish hunting from scavenging unless healing is present. The same animal can do both. Lions hunt and scavenge. Hyenas hunt and scavenge. Tyrannosaurs had no reason to reject available meat because it was already dead. The old debate asking whether they were predators or scavengers creates a false choice. Hadrosaurs also faced smaller theropods. Dromaeosaurs and juvenile tyrannosaurs may have targeted young duckbills. Eggs and hatchlings could be taken by animals too small to threaten an adult. Medium-sized predators could follow nesting colonies, exploiting the brief season when concentrated young became available. The first year was the narrowest passage. A hatchling outside the nest had speed but little mass. Ferns offered cover, yet every opening exposed it to teeth and claws. The adult herd might reduce danger, but a predator needed only one successful rush through confusion. High juvenile mortality does not mean constant visible attack. Many young died from hunger, disease, accidents, or weather. Predation becomes overemphasized because it is easy to imagine and because tooth marks are dramatic. Most deaths in a large herbivore population may have left no clear sign on bone. A hadrosaur's greatest defense was becoming common enough that the loss of individuals did not threaten the lineage. Predators could kill animals without controlling the population. Reproduction and rapid growth continuously moved new bodies into larger, safer size classes. This created a powerful ecological cycle. Productive vegetation supported herds. Herds supported tyrannosaurs. Predator pressure removed vulnerable individuals and influenced movement. Carcasses fed smaller scavengers. Nutrients returned to soil and water. The relationship was violent at the level of an individual, but stable across generations. Stability could fail during environmental stress. Drought reduces plant growth while concentrating predators and prey around water. Floods kill the young. Disease spreads through dense groups. A population already weakened by food shortage becomes easier to hunt, and predation can amplify decline even if it did not begin it. Hadrosaur skeletons preserve fractures, infections, arthritis, and tumors. Some injuries healed with thickened bone, others distorted joints and would have changed movement. A large social herbivore could survive damage that might kill a solitary small animal, perhaps because group movement reduced individual exposure or because its body carried enough reserves for recovery. Tail injuries occur repeatedly in hadrosaur fossils. Some may result from predator bites, but others could come from falls, trampling, collisions, or stress fractures. A tail held high behind a large animal was exposed during pursuit and could be struck by teeth, yet pathology must not be assigned to attack without diagnostic marks. The tail was not a whip or club specialized for defense. Its strength came from locomotor muscles and support tissues. A sideways strike from a moving adult could still be dangerous, but the skeleton lacks the enlarged terminal structures of ankylosaurs or the elongated whip-like tip of some sauropods. Kicking is mechanically plausible. The hind limbs were powerful enough to accelerate several tons of body mass. A backward or sideways blow could injure a predator, though balancing during such movement would be difficult. Most defense probably involved turning, accelerating, and staying with the group rather than standing to fight. The beak and jaws were not weapons suited to flesh, but a bite from a large hadrosaur could still cause damage through force alone. The forelimbs carried weight-bearing digits rather than sharp claws. These animals were not defenseless. Yet their anatomy prioritized feeding and travel over combat. Watch the edge of a herd rather than the center. Adults lift their heads in sequence as a scent moves across the wind. A juvenile stops chewing. The first call is low and brief. Bodies begin to turn before the predator becomes visible. Defense starts with information. A tyrannosaur emerging from cover must close distance quickly. The herd's first movement creates obstacles. Adults cross the line of attack. Dust and vegetation reduce visibility. The predator chooses one target or loses the opportunity. Confusion protects the group without requiring deliberate cooperation. One animal falls behind. Its stride is uneven from an old injury. The tyrannosaur changes direction and follows. The rest of the herd continues toward firmer ground. Natural selection does not protect individuals because they deserve survival. It preserves traits through the unequal outcome of moments like this. The carcass becomes an ecosystem. The predator opens the body. Smaller theropods arrive later. Crocodilians may feed if the remains lie near water. Beetles enter exposed tissue. Microbes break down organs. Bones separate and scatter. A flood buries some parts while others weather away. Coprolites and bite marks can identify stages of this process. Bone fragments inside fossil dung indicate consumption and digestion. Tooth scratches show where flesh was removed. Chemical changes reveal decay. A hadrosaur skeleton is therefore sometimes a record not only of the animal, but of everything that used its body afterward. Scavenging also explains why complete skulls and articulated skeletons are rare despite hadrosaur abundance. The body contains thousands of kilograms of food. Large and small animals pull it apart. Rivers move the loosened bones. A complete mummy or articulated skeleton required unusual circumstances that interrupted this ordinary destruction. Predator abundance cannot be read directly from the ratio of bones in a quarry. Carnivore teeth shed frequently and preserve well. Herbivore bone beds can overwhelm the record. Different habitats produce different burial chances. Ecological models must combine fossil counts with body size, energy requirements, and modern food web principles. Even so, the relative abundance of herbivores had to exceed that of large predators. A tyrannosaur required many prey animals across its lifetime. The Hadrosaur empire was the energetic foundation beneath the more famous carnivore. Without productive populations of duckbills and other herbivores, giant tyrannosaurs could not exist. Popular images reverse that dependence. The predator appears central, and the herd becomes scenery. In ecological terms, the plants and herbivores occupy the wider base. The tyrannosaur is impressive because a whole landscape supports it. Hadrosaurs competed with other plant eaters as well. Ceratopsids shared many North American formations. Ankylosaurs fed lower to the ground. Small ornithopods used vegetation beneath the reach of giant adults. Titanosaurs overlapped with hadrosaurs in some regions. Competition was reduced through feeding height, muzzle width, jaw mechanics, habitat preference, and seasonal movement. Studies of dinosaur park herbivores suggest that hadrosaurs could feed higher than ceratopsids and ankylosaurs by rising bipedally, while all three groups overlapped at low levels. Within that overlap, differences in beaks and teeth produced different ways of cropping and processing plants. A shared forest does not mean a shared diet. Ceratopsids used beaks and slicing dental batteries, but their jaw motion and skull construction differed from hadrosaurs. Ankylosaurs had smaller teeth and broad guts suited to lower quality plants. Hadrosaurs combined wide feeding envelopes with extensive grinding. Each lineage turned vegetation into energy through its own machinery. Late Cretaceous herbivore communities were therefore not primitive versions of modern ones. They were built from body plans with no living equivalent. A herd of hadrosaurs passed beside horned animals weighing several tons, while armored dinosaurs moved through low cover and smaller feathered theropods searched beneath them. The competition was ancient, but the ecological logic remains recognizable. Predators influenced where feeding felt safe. Dense forest provided cover for ambush, but also concealment for prey. Open ground improved visibility, but exposed young animals. Riverbanks offered water and fresh vegetation while concentrating danger. Herds had to balance food quality against the probability of attack. Night did not remove the threat. Tyrannosaur sensory anatomy suggests strong smell and useful low-light vision. Hadrosaurs may have relied on group vigilance and hearing. Low calls could pass warnings through darkness, but calls could also reveal position. Every signal carried benefit and cost. The healed bite remains the clearest proof of an encounter survived. Bone grew around the damage slowly enough to leave a rough callus. The hadrosaur compensated for pain, continued feeding, and avoided another fatal attack. Survival was not clean. It left asymmetry in the skeleton. In the quarry, the embedded tooth is darker than the surrounding bone. It points inward, frozen at the angle of impact. The predator lost it in a fraction of a second. The prey carried it through another season. Two animals entered the fossil record together, not as a staged battle, but as evidence that one failed to kill and the other managed to live. The word hadrosaur can hide the differences between animals whose skulls, bodies, and histories were separated by continents and millions of years. Place an Edmontosaurus skull beside that of Gryposaurus, Saurolophus, and Shantungosaurus, and the shared plan is obvious, but so is the variety. The empire was not one species expanding everywhere. It was a changing collection of lineages replacing, dividing, and adapting. Edmontosaurus lived near the end of the Cretaceous in western North America. Its skull was long and low, with an especially broad beak and no hollow bony crest. Adults became among the largest common hadrosaurs, and their remains occur in formations from Alberta to the Dakotas and Wyoming. Several species names have been debated, but Edmontosaurus regalis and Edmontosaurus annectens are widely recognized. Edmontosaurus regalis is generally associated with older late Campanian to early Maastrichtian rocks in Canada, while Edmontosaurus annectens occurs later, including the Hell Creek and Lance formations close to the end Cretaceous boundary. Their anatomy reflects a successful Saurolophine design lasting through major environmental change. The broad muzzle of Edmontosaurus suggests bulk feeding, though it could still choose plants through head movement and habitat selection. Mummies reveal scale patterns, hand anatomy, and soft structures above the skull and along the body. Bone beds indicate large populations. Bite marks connected directly with Tyrannosaurus. Edmontosaurus was not an oversized duck. The keratinous beak extended beyond the bone and probably formed a sharp cropping edge. Behind it, the dental batteries processed vegetation. The nostrils sat on the upper surface of the snout, not at the tip of a flexible bill, and the skull contained muscles and chambers arranged unlike those of waterfowl. Gryposaurus lived earlier and carried a prominent arched nasal boss. The name means hook-nosed lizard, referring to the raised profile of the snout. Several species are known from western North America, including forms from Alberta, Montana, and Utah. The arch may have supported display tissues and created a strong visual identity without becoming hollow. A nasal boss can look modest beside the tube of Parasaurolophus, but social signals do not need to be enormous to matter. Small differences in outline are easily recognized by animals accustomed to their own species. Color, movement, and soft tissue could make a bony arch far more noticeable in life. Brachylophosaurus carried a flat solid crest extending backward over the skull. It is known from Montana and Alberta and is represented by exceptionally preserved specimens, including the mummy called Leonardo. Skin impressions and stomach region contents associated with such fossils have contributed to reconstructions of hadrosaur external anatomy and diet. Claims about stomach contents require caution because plant material can enter a carcass after death or be mixed during burial. Exceptional preservation does not automatically prove that every object within the body outline was a final meal. Researchers compare position, concentration, chemistry, and surrounding sediment before accepting digestive contents. Prosaurolophus had a smaller crest in front of the eyes, while Saurolophus developed a long, solid spike projecting backward. These genera were related, but they did not simply represent juvenile and adult stages of one form. Their skulls differ in several features, and Saurolophus spread across both North America and Asia. Saurolophus osborni lived in Alberta, while Saurolophus angustirostris inhabited Mongolia and is known from numerous skeletons and bone beds. The Asian species could grow large, with a longer, lower skull and a crest extending behind it. Skin impressions associated with some specimens suggest soft tissue around the crest and along the body. The presence of closely related species on opposite sides of the northern continents records dispersal through high-latitude routes. During parts of the late Cretaceous, Asia and North America were connected across Beringia, or separated by distances and environments still passable to terrestrial animals. Populations moved, then diverged after isolation. Cretasaurians formed another Saurolophine radiation, including Cretasaurus, Gryposaurus, and related southern forms. Their nasal regions were often enlarged or arched. Fossils from New Mexico and Mexico show that the group remained diverse at lower latitudes, where coastal vegetation and climate differed from Alberta. Names in this group have changed repeatedly because many specimens are incomplete. Cretasaurus itself was based on a skull missing parts of the snout, and early restoration borrowed features from better-known relatives. Later discoveries forced researchers to separate what was preserved from what had been reconstructed. Museum mounts can preserve scientific history as much as anatomy. A plaster nose added to an incomplete skull may reflect the best knowledge of its decade. When later specimens reveal another shape, the mount becomes outdated but still shows how interpretation developed. Hadrosaur faces have been revised many times because the most distinctive region is also often the most fragile. Among lambeosaurines, Corythosaurus and Lambeosaurus dominate many Alberta collections. Their crests differ in profile, internal passage, and growth. Hypacrosaurus appeared later and had tall neural spines that produced a deep back profile behind the crest. Parasaurolophus remained less abundant in most deposits, but became the most visually iconic. Fossil abundance does not equal ecological importance in a simple way. A rare species may have lived in uplands that preserved poorly, migrated through the basin only seasonally, or existed at lower population density. A common species may be overrepresented by one catastrophic bone bed. Relative counts must be tied to sedimentary environment. Corythosaurus fossils from the Dinosaur Park Formation include skulls of different ages and articulated skeletons. The rounded crest contained paired nasal passages separated by thin bone. As the animal matured, the crest became taller and the internal route more extended, changing both display and resonance. A juvenile Corythosaurus standing beneath adults would see a forest of legs and deep bodies above it. Its own crest was low, its voice likely higher, its feeding height closer to the ferns. Over the next years, the skull would rise into the shape used to identify the species in every reconstruction. Lambeosaurus carried a more angular crest and may have been less common or differently distributed within the same broad region. Several species have been named, revised, combined, or separated as researchers compare skull proportions and growth. The work is detailed because a few degrees of curvature or the position of a bone contact can distinguish a true lineage from individual variation. Hadrosaur taxonomy is not finished. New fossils change character matrices, CT scans reveal internal passages, older specimens are re-prepared. Some genera disappear into synonymy, while others return as valid. The empire we describe today is a current scientific reconstruction, not a final catalog. Asia preserves hadrosaurs on an even larger scale. Shantungosaurus from eastern China is often regarded as the largest well-established hadrosaurid, with estimates exceeding 14 meters for the biggest individuals. Its skull was long and relatively low, and the body approached the mass of the largest non-sauropod herbivorous dinosaurs. A Shantungosaurus skeleton stretches through a museum gallery like a train of vertebrae and ribs. The head remains small relative to the torso, but the jaws contain the same dense batteries that powered smaller relatives. Gigantism did not require a new feeding system. It enlarged a system already effective. Shantungosaurus belonged to the broader Edmontosauran radiation, though relationships among giant Asian and North American forms continue to be studied. Its size may have reduced adult predation risk even from large tyrannosaurs, but juveniles would still have entered the food web at vulnerable scales. Tarbosaurus shared some Asian ecosystems with large hadrosaurs and could process bone with deep jaws and robust teeth. A giant duckbill facing such a predator depended on more than size. River channels, herd position, footing, health, and the first seconds of detection could decide the encounter. Syntausaurus from China was once reconstructed with a narrow unicorn-like spike rising from the skull. Better studies showed a more complex crest involving multiple bones and likely a broader soft tissue profile. The old single-prong image persisted for decades because an incomplete fossil had been interpreted literally. Syntosaurus is a useful warning. A broken structure can create a shape evolution never produced. Fossils arrive damaged by decay, pressure, erosion, and excavation. Reconstructing the original animal means identifying which edges are biological and which are fractures. Olorotitan from the Russian Far East carried a large backward-extending crest, unlike the simpler helmets of Cretaceous. Its name means giant swan, but the animal was a terrestrial lambeosaurine, living on floodplains near the end of the Cretaceous. Several individuals from the same region help reconstruct a high-latitude Asian community. Amurosaurus, also from the Amur region, is known from a bone bed containing many disarticulated individuals, especially juveniles. The skull material shows a lambeosaurine with a hollow crest, though the complete adult outline is not preserved. The site demonstrates how population structure can survive as a statistical pattern even when individual skeletons are scattered. Carnosaurus from northeastern China was closely related to Parasaurolophus and may have carried a similarly elongated crest, although complete adult crest material is limited. Its existence shows that the long tube design was not restricted to Western North America. Hadrosaurs in Asia shared landscapes with animals unfamiliar from North American formations. Therizinosaurs carried enormous claws and broad herbivorous guts. Oviraptorosaurs tended nests. Dinocaris combined a duck-like snout, tall back, and giant arms in a body unrelated to hadrosaurs. Titanosaurs browsed above them. The same ecological roles were divided among different evolutionary experiments. The Nemegt floodplains were relatively wet compared with older desert deposits in Mongolia. Channels carried sand through wooded lowlands. Fish, turtles, crocodilians, birds, and mammals occupied the water margins. Saurolophus herds fed where Tarbosaurus hunted and scavenged. In other Asian regions, hadrosaurs lived near coasts or within volcanic basins. Plant communities included conifers, flowering trees, shrubs, ferns, and horsetails. Climate varied over the enormous continent. There was no single Asian hadrosaur habitat, just as there was no single North American one. Geography repeatedly split lineages. A population crossing Beringia entered a new basin. Mountains rose behind it. Climate shifted. The route closed. Over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, the isolated animals changed in skull form, body size, and feeding anatomy until their bones became distinguishable as another species. This is how an empire grows without intention. Dispersal creates opportunity. Isolation creates difference. Extinction removes competitors. New plant communities reward feeding flexibility. The same basic hadrosaur plan appears again and again, modified enough to fit another landscape. Species lists can make this history feel static, as though every named animal occupied a fixed place on a shelf. In life, populations were moving targets. Boundaries shifted with each generation. Hybridization may have occurred between close relatives. Local forms appeared and disappeared without leaving fossils. Named species are the visible peaks of a much denser evolutionary landscape. A skull in Alberta and a skull in Mongolia share a crest angle, a tooth pattern, and a particular contact between bones. Those details reveal kinship across what is now the Pacific. The animals never knew continents by name. They followed valleys, coasts, and generations of habitat until their descendants stood on opposite sides of the world. In the final view, the differences matter as much as the resemblance. The broad face of Edmontosaurus, the arched nose of Gryposaurus, the solid spike of Saurolophus, the helmet of Corythosaurus, the tube of Parasaurolophus, the immense frame of Shantungosaurus, one family, but many ways to be a duck-billed dinosaur. Near the end of the Cretaceous, a small lambeosaurine lived in what is now Morocco. Its jaw entered sediment, laid down in a marine-influenced environment, surrounded by fossils from a coastline at the edge of Africa. The animal was not supposed to be there according to older maps. Open water separated Africa from the northern continents where hadrosaurs were best known. The fossil was named Ajnabia odysseus. Ajnabia means stranger or foreigner, and the species name refers to a long journey. Only parts of the jaws are known, so the complete animal remains uncertain, but the bones place it among lambeosaurines related to European forms. The discovery did not prove that one individual swam an ocean. It proved that a population descended from northern hadrosaurs reached North Africa and survived long enough to leave fossils. The route could have involved island chains, temporary emergent land, short water crossings, rafting events, or combinations repeated over generations. A large terrestrial animal can cross water more easily than intuition suggests. Elephants swim between islands. Deer reach offshore land. Storms carry groups of animals on vegetation mats. Most such events fail and leave no descendants. Biogeography records the rare success because only successful arrivals produce later fossils. The Cretaceous geography of the Tethys region was complex and changed with sea level and tectonics. Distances between islands varied. Currents shifted. A crossing impossible at one time could become manageable later. Reconstructing dispersal requires combining dinosaur relationships with marine geology, island positions, and the ages of the fossils. Ajnabia was followed by more African evidence. Mincaria bata, described in 2024 from Moroccan phosphate deposits, was another small mature lambeosaurine, estimated at roughly 3.5 meters long. Fused bones in the brain case showed that its small size was not simply youth. The same deposits also contain larger hadrosaur bones, implying that at least 3 duck-billed species may have lived in the region near the end of the Cretaceous. What first appeared to be one improbable immigrant became a local radiation. Hadrosaurs had not merely touched Africa, they had diversified there. A new Moroccan lambeosaurine reported in 2025 added further evidence that the North African fauna was more complex than the first fragments suggested. The exact taxonomy will continue to change as additional skulls and skeletons emerge, but the broad result is stable. Hadrosaurids crossed the marine barriers around Africa and established several lineages. Small body size can be advantageous on islands and restricted landmasses. A smaller animal requires less food, reaches maturity with fewer resources, and can maintain a population within limited habitat. But dwarfism also increases vulnerability to predators and environmental disturbance. Evolution balances local food supply, competition, reproduction, and isolation. The European archipelago produced its own variety of hadrosauroids and hadrosaurids. Telmatosaurus from Romania retained several primitive features and reached a moderate size. Tethys from Italy had unusual limb proportions and lived on an island in the Tethys region. Lambeosaurines, such as Arenosaurus and Pararhabdodon, inhabited the Ibero-Armorican landmass formed by parts of present-day Spain and France. Island does not always mean small. Some European hadrosaurids were substantial animals, and island size changed through time. Populations could arrive during low sea level, expand when land connections opened, and become isolated when water returned. Each island had a geological history rather than a permanent shoreline. Hadrosaurs was discovered near Trieste in northeastern Italy in rocks that formed on the Adriatic Dinaric Carbonate platform. The skeleton is unusually complete for a European hadrosauroid. Its limbs and body proportions differ from those of giant mainland hadrosaurids, reflecting both ancestry and the conditions of an island ecosystem. Telmatosaurus lived in the Hague region of Romania, part of an island fauna famous for reduced body size in several dinosaur groups. Its skull was less specialized than that of advanced hadrosaurids, preserving a stage of hadrosauroid evolution that survived late in an isolated region, while more derived forms dominated elsewhere. A jaw from Telmatosaurus has been described with a benign tumor-like growth called an ameloblastoma, a condition known in living animals and humans. The pathology shows that ancient dinosaurs developed diseases through cellular processes still operating today. Isolation did not make their biology alien at the microscopic level. A diseased jaw is an intimate fossil. It belonged to one animal coping with swelling, pain, or altered feeding. The island ecosystem may be reconstructed in broad terms, but the pathology returns attention to an individual body within it. Farther west, Lambeosaurines reached the European islands late in the Cretaceous. Their relationships point toward dispersal from Asia, followed by diversification in Europe. Some of these lineages may then have moved south into Africa, turning the archipelago into a bridge across the Tethyan Seas. A crest fragment found in Spain can therefore connect three regions. Its internal passages resemble Asian relatives. Its age places it within a European island fauna. Its close African descendants suggest another crossing later. One bone becomes evidence for a route traveled across generations and changing coastlines. South America tells a different story. Hadrosaurids arrived late, entering ecosystems long dominated by titanosaurs and native ornithopods. Fossils from Argentina include Secarnosaurus, Bonapartosaurus, Hualasaurus, Kelumapusora, and other forms whose relationships have been revised as new material is described. Many South American hadrosaurids belong to saurolophine lineages related broadly to North American Cretaceous. Their ancestors probably moved south through connections or island chains between the Americas during the late Cretaceous. Once established in Patagonia, they evolved as a southern radiation sometimes called Austrocretaceuria. The route did not resemble the modern Isthmus of Panama, which did not yet exist in its present form. Volcanic islands and temporary land connections may have formed stepping stones through the Caribbean region. Sea level changes exposed and submerged passages. Dispersal could occur in pulses separated by long isolation. South American hadrosaur taxonomy is challenging because many specimens are incomplete and some named genera have been questioned or revised. Bones collected decades ago are being re-examined with modern comparisons. New discoveries can reveal that material assigned to one species actually belongs to several, or that supposed differences reflect distortion. Kelumapusora from Patagonia is known from a bone bed and represents a large saurolophine. Hualasaurus also lived near the end of the Cretaceous. These animals shared southern landscapes with titanosaurs, ankylosaurs, abelisaurids, megaraptorans, unenlarging dromaeosaurs, birds, crocodilians, and mammals. The ecological transition must have been significant. A northern-style dental battery and broad-cropping beak entered a plant community where other herbivores had evolved for millions of years. Hadrosaurs did not replace every native group, but their appearance added another large-bodied feeding strategy to the southern continents. Gomcoca nanoi from southern Chile complicates the story further. Described in 2023, it was not a true hadrosaurid, but a more primitive hadrosauroid surviving into the Maastrichtian, near the end of the dinosaur age. Its fossils come from subantarctic Patagonia and represent several individuals. Gonkoken reached roughly 4 meters in length and combined advanced and primitive features. Its survival shows that the southern tip of South America acted as a refuge for an older hadrosauroid lineage after true hadrosaurs had become widespread elsewhere. The name Gonkoken draws from the language of the Anakienk people and refers to similarity with a wild duck or swan. The fossils were collected in the Rio de las Chinas Valley of Chilean Patagonia, where sediments preserve forests, rivers, and a high-latitude ecosystem connected geographically to Antarctica. At those latitudes, winter darkness affected every animal. The climate was warmer than modern Patagonia, but seasonal changes remained strong. Deciduous plants lost leaves. Floodplains cooled. Food became limited. A smaller hadrosauroid may have used habitats and diets different from those of giant northern hadrosaurids. Hadrosaur remains also occur in Antarctica. The first report from Vega Island was based on a cheek tooth from latest Cretaceous rocks. Later discoveries added more ornithopod material. A tooth is limited evidence, but its structure can identify the dental battery of a duck-billed dinosaur. Imagine finding that tooth in an Antarctic field camp. Wind moves across exposed rock. Ice surrounds the island. The fossil is small enough to fit in a pocket, but it came from an animal living in a forested polar world before the continent froze. Geography has transformed more completely than the tooth. Late Cretaceous Antarctica supported conifers, flowering plants, ferns, birds, marine reptiles along the coast, and terrestrial dinosaurs inland. It remained connected to South America through the Antarctic Peninsula region, allowing faunal exchange. Hadrosauroids could move through these southern landscapes without crossing the vast ice sheets that define the continent today, because those ice sheets did not yet exist. The southern record exposes a bias in how the dinosaur age is remembered. North American and Asian hadrosaurs are known from complete skulls and mounted herds. African and Antarctic forms may be represented by jaws or teeth. The difference reflects exposure, access, collecting history, and preservation as much as original diversity. A fossil family can appear to originate or dominate where its rocks are easiest to study. New fieldwork in Morocco, Chile, Mexico, and polar regions repeatedly expands the map. The empire was always larger than the museum record suggested. Oceanic dispersal does not require hadrosaurs to be marine specialists. Large animals can float and swim. Their lungs and air-filled body spaces provide buoyancy. Strong hind limbs generate thrust. A crossing of tens of kilometers remains dangerous but physically possible, especially between visible islands. The old aquatic hadrosaur model was wrong because it made water the center of daily life. Recognizing occasional water crossing does not revive that model. An elephant swimming between islands remains a terrestrial elephant. A hadrosaur crossing a channel remains a terrestrial dinosaur. Rafting is another possibility, especially for juveniles or small species. Floods can tear mats of vegetation and soil from riverbanks, carrying animals into coastal currents. Most perish. A pregnant female, a mixed group, or repeated arrivals would be needed to establish a viable population. The low probability becomes meaningful across millions of years. Dispersal events are invisible at the moment they happen. No trackway runs across the seafloor. No fossil preserves a herd halfway between islands. Researchers infer the event from phylogeny. Relatives appear in places separated by water, and their branching order identifies the direction most consistent with the data. This inference can change. A new species may alter the family tree. A revised geological age may reverse which fossil is older. An unknown land connection may appear in tectonic reconstruction. Biogeographic stories remain hypotheses tested against every new bone. The broad pattern, however, is difficult to avoid. Duck-billed dinosaurs and their close relatives spread through North America and Asia, entered Europe, reached Africa, crossed into South America, and lived at Antarctic latitudes. They did this before ships, before permanent grasslands, and before the modern continents assumed their positions. On each landmass, the body changed. A smaller frame on an island, a different jaw in Mexico, an old lineage surviving in Chile, a Lambeosaurine crest in Morocco. The empire did not erase local history, it absorbed geography into anatomy. A partial jaw from a phosphate mine may look insignificant beside a complete Edmontosaurus mummy, yet it answers another kind of question. Not what the skin looked like, not how the foot met the ground. It answers where the family could go. The Moroccan jaw rests in a tray, its tooth row curving through pale bone. Beyond the museum wall lies the Atlantic, wider now than any barrier its ancestors faced. The fossil cannot show the crossing. It shows that the crossing ended with living animals on the far shore. By the Maastrichtian, the final age of the Cretaceous, Hadrosaurs had already occupied their empire for millions of years. Some of the great Campanian lineages were gone. Cretaceous and Lambeosaurus no longer moved across Alberta's floodplains. New species had replaced them, and coastlines had shifted as the western interior seaway withdrew. The family remained widespread, but the world around it was entering another configuration. North America was becoming less divided by inland water. Broad coastal plains persisted, and rivers continued to carry sediment east from rising mountains. In the north, Edmontosaurus regalis inhabited environments older than the latest Hell Creek fauna. Farther south and later in time, Edmontosaurus annectens became one of the dominant large herbivores living beside Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus. The Hell Creek Formation spans the last part of the Maastrichtian in portions of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. It records rivers, forested floodplains, ponds, soils, and channels formed during roughly the final 1 to 2 million years before the end Cretaceous impact. Its fossils include dinosaurs, mammals, birds, turtles, crocodilians, fish, amphibians, plants, pollen, and freshwater invertebrates. Edmontosaurus was abundant within this system. Isolated bones, partial skeletons, bone beds, tracks, skin impressions, and feeding traces all show a large population using the lowlands. Adults browsed and bulk fed across mixed vegetation. Young occupied lower feeding zones. Herds moved between channels, while Tyrannosaurus followed the same river corridors. A final Cretaceous morning would not look like a world waiting to end. The river rises slowly after rain. Broad leaves collect water. Conifers stand beyond the channel. An Edmontosaurus pulls branches into its beak. A Triceratops feeds several hundred meters away. Birds move through the canopy. Mammals remain mostly hidden. Nothing in the behavior of the animals predicts the object already moving through space toward Earth. The Hadrosaurs had survived sea level change, volcanic episodes, drought, shifting plant communities, predator turnover, and the opening and closing of dispersal routes. Evolutionary success can prepare a lineage for many familiar pressures. It cannot guarantee survival against an event outside the range of everything its populations have previously experienced. Around 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across struck near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The collision excavated the Chicxulub crater and released energy on a planetary scale. Rock vaporized. Ejecta entered the atmosphere. Earthquakes and tsunamis spread outward. Wildfires affected vast areas, although their intensity and global extent varied by region. The impact itself lasted minutes. The biological crisis unfolded across hours, seasons, and years. Dust, soot, and sulfur-bearing aerosols reduced sunlight. Photosynthesis collapsed. Temperatures changed sharply. Food webs based on living vegetation and plankton lost their foundation. Acid rain and fires added regional stress. Large herbivores depended on enormous daily flows of plant material. Hadrosaurs could process tough food and move across wide areas, but they could not feed when new growth failed across continents. Stored body reserves bought time, not recovery. Reproduction slowed or stopped. Eggs and juveniles became impossible to support. Populations that had absorbed ordinary mortality for millions of years faced the simultaneous failure of the entire plant economy. Large body size became a disadvantage. An adult Edmontosaurus required far more food than a small bird or mammal. Long generation times slowed recovery. Eggs and exposed nests were vulnerable to unstable temperatures and scarcity. Herding could not solve a shortage extending beyond the horizon. Individuals died before the lineage did. Some were injured by blast effects or fire near the impact region. Others survived the first weeks and weakened as vegetation disappeared. Rivers carried ash and debris. Carcasses accumulated near remaining water. Predators scavenged until prey became scarce, then declined themselves. The Deccan traps in India were also erupting around this interval, releasing lava and gases through a prolonged volcanic episode. Scientists continue to study how volcanism and impact interacted. The impact is strongly supported as the immediate driver of the mass extinction, while Deccan volcanism may have stressed climate and ecosystems before and after it. The extinction boundary is not preserved equally everywhere. In some rocks, a thin clay layer contains elevated iridium, shocked minerals, glassy spherules, and other impact evidence. In terrestrial formations, erosion can remove part of the sequence. Dinosaur fossils found near the boundary must be placed carefully to avoid mistaking reworked older bones for animals that survived afterward. No reliable non-avian dinosaur fossils occur in younger Paleogene rocks as living survivors. Hadrosaurs vanish with Triceratops, Ankylosaurs, Titanosaurs, and non-avian theropods. Birds survive, preserving one branch of dinosaur evolution, but the duck-billed line ends completely. Extinction was not caused because hadrosaurs had become inferior or exhausted. New species and broad distributions continued near the end. African lambeosaurines were diversifying, South American forms were established. Edmontosaurus remained abundant. A successful family met an environmental collapse too rapid and extensive for its life history. The final fossil occurrence of a species rarely captures its final living individual. The senior lips effect describes how an incomplete fossil record makes lineages appear to disappear before they actually did. Hadrosaurs may have survived somewhere for years after the impact, but there is no evidence for recovery or persistence into the established Paleogene world. An empire can be widespread and still be fragile when every region depends on the same basic process. Hadrosaurs varied in crest, size, diet, and reproduction, but all depended on photosynthetic plants, stable nesting opportunities, and years of juvenile growth. The impact attacked that shared foundation. Small animals with low food requirements, sheltering behavior, aquatic food webs, seed-eating capacity, or rapid reproduction had better chances. Birds, mammals, turtles, crocodilians, amphibians, fish, and many invertebrates survived in selective patterns. Survival did not mean avoiding suffering. It meant enough individuals persisted to reproduce after the crisis. On a floodplain, far from the crater, the last local hadrosaurs may have walked through a dim landscape under an altered sky. Their calls carried across forests, losing leaves. The dental batteries still worked. The legs still carried them. Every adaptation remained functional, but the vegetation no longer returned at the rate their bodies required. There is no final trackway known to be the last one. No skeleton can be identified as the final member of Hadrosauridae. Extinction is distributed across populations, each disappearing at a different place and time, until no breeding group remains. The last animal may die without unusual burial, leaving no fossil at all. The empire ends in absence. Above the boundary, the broad teeth stop appearing. The crests are gone. Large three-toed hadrosaur tracks do not cross into younger sediment. River deposits continue forming, but the animals that once dominated their banks are missing. For a time, Paleogene landscapes were filled with recovering plant communities and smaller survivors. Fern spikes appear in some boundary records, showing disturbance plants spreading after devastation. Mammals diversified. Birds continued evolving. Crocodilians remained in rivers. The ecological roles once occupied by multi-ton duckbills stayed empty. Large mammalian herbivores would eventually evolve chewing systems capable of processing abrasive vegetation, but none recreated the hadrosaur dental battery exactly. Ungulates developed molars, complex stomachs, hooves, horns, and herd behavior through separate evolutionary routes. Similar ecological problems produced new solutions from different anatomy. The resemblance between hadrosaurs and later grazing or browsing mammals is therefore functional, not genealogical. Both could form large social populations and process fibrous plants. Both shaped vegetation through feeding and movement. Yet a hadrosaur's jaw, pelvis, tail, egg-based reproduction, and archosaurian biology belong to a world with no direct modern equivalent. Their bones remained beneath the recovering ecosystems. Rivers cut into older channels and reburied fragments. Minerals replaced tissues. Continents moved. The Atlantic widened. The western interior seaway disappeared entirely. Erosion removed kilometers of sediment in some regions and exposed fossil-bearing layers in others. Humans entered the story so late that the entire hadrosaur radiation had been over for roughly 65 million years before anyone recognized a dinosaur bone as the remains of an extinct reptile. Indigenous peoples encountered fossils long before formal paleontology, and local knowledge formed around unusual bones and tracks. Scientific naming came later, within a few centuries of the present. Large bones were first noticed in a New Jersey marl pit in 1838. In 1858, William Parker Folke and John Hopkins excavated the more complete specimen, and Joseph Leidy named it Hadrosaurus folke. The skeleton was mounted for public display in Philadelphia in 1868, becoming a sensation. People stood before an animal unlike anything living, reconstructed from bones taken out of ordinary ground. The mount was upright and incomplete, but it transformed dinosaurs into active, towering animals in public imagination. Later discoveries added skulls, crests, mummies, nests, and bone beds. Hadrosaurs became central to the history of dinosaur science because they were abundant enough to preserve almost every kind of evidence paleontology can use. Their fossils also became entangled with the bone wars and later museum competition. Expeditions sought complete skeletons for display. Specimens were shipped across countries and oceans. Some were collected under colonial systems that removed fossils from local communities and placed them in distant institutions. The scientific value is real, but the history of collection includes unequal power and contested ownership. Modern paleontology increasingly involves local researchers, community partnerships, legal protection, digital access, and repatriation discussions. Discoveries in Mexico, Morocco, Chile, China, and other regions are changing a field once narrated mainly through North American and European institutions. The empire on the ground was global. The history of studying it has been geographically uneven. Correcting that imbalance does more than add names. It changes evolutionary trees, dispersal routes, ecological models, and the question of where major lineages originated. A hadrosaur specimen moves through several lives after discovery. In the field, it is a patch of bone in rock. During excavation, it becomes a plaster jacket labeled with a locality and horizon. In preparation, it becomes anatomy. In a collection, it becomes a catalog number. In a paper, it becomes data. In a museum, it becomes a public animal again. The locality information is as important as the bone. A beautiful skull without precise geological context loses age, environment, and association. Fossils collected illegally or sold without documentation may retain display value while losing much of their scientific meaning. Hadrosaurs are common enough to make the damage easy to underestimate. Preparation can take years. A crest filled with hard matrix requires fine tools under magnification. Teeth may be stabilized one at a time. Cracks are consolidated. Missing sections are supported but kept distinguishable from original bone. Three-dimensional scans record internal structure and allow replicas to be shared without moving the fossil. Under a microscope, the empire divides into smaller evidence. Pollen grains identify plants. Tooth scratches record jaw movement. Bone cells reveal growth. Mineral films preserve scale texture. Isotopies suggest water sources and climate. A quarry mapped centimeter by centimeter reveals how carcasses moved before burial. The largest conclusions depend on these small observations. Global dispersal begins with a character on a jaw. Parental care begins with immature bones in a nest. Predation begins with a puncture surrounded by healed tissue. Communication begins with the geometry of an airway. Each conclusion carries a level of confidence. Some are nearly certain. Hadrosaurs were herbivorous dinosaurs with dental batteries, and many could walk on 2 or 4 legs. Others are strongly supported. Many species were social. Crests aided communication, and Maiasaura provided extended care. More specific claims, such as exact calls, migration routes, colors, or courtship rituals, remain reconstructions. Scientific caution does not reduce the animals, it restores the difference between evidence and imagination. The known anatomy is already extraordinary. Hundreds of teeth functioning as one surface. Nasal passages longer than a human body. Herds leaving paths through polar mud. Hatchlings growing into multi-ton adults. Populations crossing islands and continents. The tidal duck build can make these achievements seem almost accidental. The bill is memorable because it resembles something familiar. The rest of the animal is harder to compare. No living herbivore combines that beak with a dinosaurian dental battery, a muscular tail, alternating bipedal and quadrupedal posture, hollow resonating crests, and egg-laying reproduction. Hadrosaurs were sometimes called the cows of the Cretaceous because of their abundance and ecological role. The comparison helps explain biomass, but it can also flatten them into background animals. Cattle are themselves complex social herbivores. Hadrosaurs were equally adapted to their own world, not generic prey waiting for tyrannosaurs. Their success forced predators to evolve around them. It influenced plant communities through feeding and trampling. It affected the distribution of dung, carcasses, and nutrients. It created paths used by other animals. An empire of herbivores changes the world without needing weapons or dominance displays. The dental battery may have been the central innovation, but it worked only because the body around it solved every related demand. The beak gathered food. The cheeks contained it. The teeth reduced it. The gut fermented it. The legs reached new patches. The herd located resources and detected danger. The nests replaced losses. The crests kept animals in contact. Remove any one part, and the radiation changes. Without continuous tooth replacement, abrasive food destroys the feeding surface. Without rapid growth, juveniles remain vulnerable longer. Without quadrupedal support, giant adults become harder to sustain. Without flexible reproduction and dispersal, the family remains regional. This interdependence is why a fossil skeleton should not be read bone by bone alone. The femur connects to migration and growth. The crest connects to social structure. The jaw connects to plant evolution. The eggshell connects to population recovery. Anatomy becomes ecology when the parts are placed back into a living landscape. Return to the riverbank where the first tracks crossed wet mud. The herd has moved beyond sight. Water settles into the deeper prints. Plant fragments drift across them. A small theropod walks along the edge and leaves another set of tracks between the hadrosaur toes. By evening, the surface is crowded with ordinary activity. The next flood lays down silt. More sediment follows over centuries. The river abandons the channel. Forest grows above the old bank. Another river cuts through it, then disappears. The track layer sinks under younger rock as the basin fills. Above it, the entire remainder of the Cretaceous passes. Hadrosaurs diversify into forms the track maker never saw. Continents shift, new crests evolve, herds reach places beyond the ancestral range. Then, the asteroid strikes, and the family ends. The footprint remains below all of it. Pressure turns sediment to stone. Groundwater carries minerals through the layer. The original organic material is gone, but the shape persists because mud once moved around a living foot. Later uplift raises the rock. Wind and rain begin removing the layers above. A paleontologist finds the track not because it was destined to be found, but because erosion exposes it during the narrow interval before erosion destroys it. The surface is cleaned. Measurements are taken. A cast may be made. The direction of travel is mapped alongside the smaller prints. The track cannot identify the exact species with certainty. Feet vary less than skulls. It may belong to a hadrosaurid or close hadrosauroid known from bones nearby. The cautious label preserves what the evidence supports, yet the broad animal is clear enough, a large duck-billed herbivore moving with others across a river plain. Its heel pad shows weight distribution. The stride shows speed. The depth records pressure and mud consistency. The smaller print beside it suggests another body in the same moment. Trackways are behavior converted into geometry. Nothing in the print preserves a crest, a caul, or a dental battery. Those come from other fossils. Paleontology combines separate animals because no single specimen contains the whole species. A skull from one site, skin from another, a nest from another, and tracks from another are brought together through anatomy and geological age. This composite can be wrong in details. A soft crest may belong only to one lineage. A nesting strategy may not apply across the family. A gait may vary with size. Good reconstruction keeps those differences visible rather than building one universal hadrosaur from every exceptional fossil. The family contained giants and dwarfs, high-latitude residents and tropical coastal forms, narrow and broad muzzles, solid and hollow crests, precocial and more dependent young. Their empire was powerful because it was diverse. New discoveries will continue to change it. A jaw in an old collection may become a new species. A CT scan may reveal another airway. A polar bone bed may clarify age structure. A skin film may preserve an unexpected ornament. A tooth from an underexplored continent may move the origin of an entire branch. The animals do not become less real when names change. Taxonomy is a human map drawn over evolving populations. Edmontosaurus did not know it belonged to Saurolophinae. Parasaurolophus did not know its crest would become iconic. Maiasaura did not know its nests would alter ideas about dinosaur behavior. They knew, in the limited way any animal knows, the immediate world. The smell of water, the pressure of other bodies, the location of feeding grounds, the call of a nearby animal, pain in an injured tail, the pull to return to a nesting plane, the change of light across a season. Those experiences are not preserved as memories, they are inferred from structures and patterns. Science cannot restore the inner life of a hadrosaur, but it can narrow the possibilities until the animal becomes more than a silhouette. In one museum drawer, dozens of isolated hadrosaur teeth may be arranged by locality. They appear repetitive until their ridges, enamel distribution, curvature, and wear are compared. One came from a juvenile. Another belonged to an adult near the end of its life. Some were shed naturally. Others remained locked in jaw fragments. Together they represent thousands of meals taken from a landscape that can now be reconstructed only from pollen, leaves, wood, and sediment. The same collection may hold vertebrae with healed fractures, eggshell from a nesting horizon, and a block of skin texture too fragile for permanent display. None is complete enough to become a famous mount. Scientific understanding grows from this ordinary material as much as from spectacular skeletons. A species is defined by diagnostic bones, but a way of life emerges from samples large enough to show variation. Variation is important because no herd consisted of ideal anatomical diagrams. Individuals differed in age, size, health, and perhaps color. Some crests were damaged, some jaws grew asymmetrically, some animals survived lean seasons that left marks in bone, others died before reaching half-adult size. The empire was made from imperfect bodies that functioned well enough to reproduce. A complete reconstruction should therefore include uncertainty and difference. Not every Edmontosaurus reached maximum length. Not every Maiasaura nest succeeded. Not every Parasaurolophus produced the same note. Population biology lives between the average and the exception, and fossils preserve both unevenly. Even the name duck-billed carries useful tension. It begins with resemblance, the human habit of understanding an unfamiliar animal through something living. Then, the resemblance breaks apart under study. The bill leads to a keratinous beak, the beak leads to dental batteries, the batteries lead to plant communities, and the plant communities lead outward into climate, migration, predators, nests, and extinction. A simple nickname opens into an entire Cretaceous system. This is why hadrosaurs can seem ordinary at first and become more remarkable the longer they are examined. They did not depend on one spectacular weapon. Their achievement was integration. Food entered efficiently, teeth renewed continuously, bodies shifted between 2 and 4 legs, signals moved through crests and soft tissue. Young grew quickly, populations dispersed across barriers, success accumulated through systems that worked together every day. The skeleton in a gallery stands alone because architecture requires space around it. In life, it rarely would have been alone for long. Other hadrosaurs moved nearby. Plants pressed against its flanks, insects landed on its skin, microbes filled its gut, tracks crossed beneath its feet. The animal belonged to relationships that no mount can physically include. The duck-billed empires lasted through a span of time longer than the entire history of humans. Species arose, spread, divided, and vanished while the family continued. Their success was not measured by invulnerability. It was measured by generations, by the repeated conversion of leaves into growth, eggs into herds, and movement into new populations. They left no descendants. Birds preserve the theropod branch of dinosaurs, but no living animal carries hadrosaur ancestry forward. Their evolutionary experiment ended completely at the boundary. What remains is geological rather than biological. On the stone surface, the adult footprint still points inland. Beside it, the smaller track follows the same direction. The edges are worn now, softened by erosion and the touch of air after millions of years underground. But the relationship between them remains visible. Two animals moved together, and the ground kept enough of that moment to show they were not alone. The river and forest are gone, and the empire ended at the close of the Cretaceous. The steppe remains in stone.